Good morning, Grill Country peeps. Yeah, I wanted to do a live stream here. We'll see if we get anybody to join. But there's been, I did a live stream that Paul did a little bit of a treatment on last week, and it was it was tracking the surge into orthodoxy. Um, but really, what I wanted to talk about more than just it's not Orthodox versus Protestant. What really was fascinating to me, being if you're someone of my age who grew up in so I went to church in the 70s. Yes, I'm that old. Where all mainline tradition Protestant churches were pretty traditional in some sort of liturgical sense, and then to see this shift into, once you had, again, I keep talking about post Vatican II because there was a definite shift in the Catholic Church that way too. But the Jesus movement came up, and then there was this definite move in the late 80s, early 90s, and in the 2000s, what we see today. There was this shift towards this kind of seeker irrelevance church, contemporary church, and if you were trying to plant churches, and I was someone who started in the mid to the late 2000s and up till about 4 years ago when I started attending Orthodox Church, was trying to plant churches in that context. And, truly, if you wanted to plant a church, there was the Willow Creek model. Paul talks about that, he actually went and attended those things as he was helping trying to plant even CRC churches. That if you grew up during that time frame and you were behind the scenes at churches, that clearly was kind of what was happening. And then now we're seeing this shift towards more traditional forms. And um, and it's undeniable, and it's shocking. Like it's shocking to me that this is happening, given kind of what we saw over the past 30 to 40 years. And so, it's a leading indicator. That's why Paul's treating it. Listen, Paul tries, he watches movements within the churches, and he's been clearly doing it and doing it longer than I have. So there's an undeniable shift towards the traditional that's happening, and even in this little corner, and I know it can frustrate certain people, but there is a shift into, let's just say orthodoxy, or even people, joining the Catholic Church after the struggles that they've had. So that's fascinating. And then at the same time, I hear all this talk, and I get it. I know Nate's talking about it here on Grill Country. Um, Dempsey, we've had these conversations. This term Paul's talking about, this term of this meta modern Christianity, and listen, I'm not very smart, so I want to do a just chatting here with you guys and kind of flesh this out a little bit, because I have these kind of these different thoughts that are going on at the same time. And I think there's this move towards this. There is this thing in the air. Lots of people are talking about it across lots of different, um, to people who are in different places are talking about this meta modern Christianity. So it's this real thing that's going on. And then yet there's this shift in traditionalism, which is really fascinating to me. I think we got these two things that are kind of going on at the same time, and I'm trying to kind of make sense of it, And so um, all we have is our lived experiences, and so I've participated in everything from traditional mainline Protestantism into kind of the Willow Creek model, Seeker model church, to house church and all those sorts of things. So I participated in that. Now I spent the last 4 years, immersing myself in Orthodoxy, and we just came, through Holy Week, and so now I've experienced, you know, you know, the most tradiest of traditional sorts of things or whatever, and it's been, it's kind of been fascinating to me. And so how do we get these two things to kind of um, we're in this really interesting time in history. So anyway, I wanted to play something. So I watched this, and Christian just put this clip up, and I actually reached out to Hezi here real quick. I don't know if he can join. I think it's fascinating, but I want to play a couple things that really kind of caught my eye. I think are taught like with this conversation. I think are really interesting where Hezy's talking about. So I want to play a couple clips here, and then I'm going to play something that Jonathan Pajot put out last week on the icons of the Holy Week, and just kind of bring this conversation. Maybe we'll get in and kind of try and flesh this out. So let me see if you guys in the chat would let me know if you can hear this sound. I'd appreciate it.
The rabbis were trying to stretch their imagination to like, what does a printer look like? What does like IVF look like? As far as they can. Maimonides talks about like, 1,000 years ago, like a plane, like a metal ship in the sky flying. So I think that that was a very smart move to try to go to the extreme, to try to really cover all your bases, so to speak. My fear is that while I believe Judaism is a phenomenal and a divinely inspired operating system, it is time for an update. Okay. One has to do so with care, of course, but it's and like I said, releasing or removing our exoskeleton is very, very difficult, both politically, culturally, emotionally. So it's very.
And so I found that fascinating, right? Because again, as I've been, one of the things that I've been in, and that's why I hope Hezi will come in, because in terms of kind of the form of Judaism with the prayers, synagogue, how they're doing it. When he's talking about the update, I'd really be interested in what he means by that update, because I think I think it is very interesting, because one of the things that, again, I'm just coming off of Holy Week, and if you go through, we read through Sunday night through all the way through Pascha midnight. We read through all of these services and all the scripture, and everything gets tied together. And there's all of there are these rituals and these patterns that we go through that are very deep, and it goes beyond kind of a surface layer, and it kind of opens up all these things here. And so, participating in these patterns and these things have illuminated like my orientation and my direction in a really fascinating way. And so you have that, and that's remained pretty unchanged for well over 1,000 years. But yet, I don't want to reject this impulse. And they're going to talk about Jordan Peterson here a little bit. I think put a little more of a clip at this. So anyway, this again, traditional shift, these deep patterns that have remained the same, that I think are extremely important and help you set your direction and illuminate things in an amazing way. Yet, we're clearly in this time of it feels like needing an update. And so what does that mean, or what does that look like?
It's hard to do that, but a part of it is definitely dialogue with our Christian brothers and our Muslim brothers, because otherwise it's not going to work. And Maimonides, this was censored for many, many years. Now, no longer. He gives a beautiful passage talking about ultimately we do not know the path of God, and his ways are only his ways, are not ours. But he sees Jesus and the Muslim, he says, Jesus and the Muslim who came after him, aka Muhammad, are ultimately path makers for God. Right? Now that is a
Foxman, I'll need you to jump in then as we have this conversation.
Very, very powerful statement. To say something like that. There are rabbis that talk about how we could potentially even accept Muhammad as a prophet, as long as, again, there's some kosher moves being done. But
that's the language. That's the language that's used about Peterson a lot.
What do you mean?
As a path towards, like a path maker.
Yeah, as a path maker for sure. So I when Jethro wants to leave the camp, he's like, guys, I'm done with this. So Moses tells him, bro, you can't go anywhere. Well, he's not his bro, he's his father-in-law. Dad, you can't go anywhere.
All right, let me go ahead here a little bit. Where's this? I think got this. Let me come here.
When I was much younger, when I was reading the story of Bilam, the prophet. I don't know if
is that Balaam's donkey?
Exactly, Balaam. Right. So I'm reading the story. First of all, no Israelite is in the story. Right. The sages tell us Moses wrote the Torah, and also wrote this specific story through prophecy. But in the middle of our most holy text, we suddenly have a story about this prophet who's not a Jew that's out to get us, and he's a very powerful prophet, and he's having a conversation with God. What? Who's this dude? Why is he having a conversation? And our sages tell us that we have a saying which there never was amongst Israel someone as great as Moses. The qualification is in Israel, but in the world there was someone as great as Moses. That's Balaam. And the idea was God says, like, it's not fair that I only give a prophet like Moses to the Israelites. I'm also going to give the world an option as well. Here you go. Here's Darth Vader, so to speak. Right? You could use this. However, how does he want to use the Force? How does he want to participate? And you see different examples between him and Abraham. Abraham wakes up in the morning and gets his donkey prepared. The same terminology is used with Bilam when he wakes up in the morning and gets his donkey prepared. And there's a sense of where you see like both of them have this potential. One is using it for evil, so to speak. Now, Bilam sees the encampment of the Israelites and it's properly oriented. And he says he tries to curse them, but only a blessing comes out. And he says, as long as you're properly oriented, you can't be affected. And it's as if God was telling, hey, Israelites, I'm having a conversation with the rest of the world all the time. You should understand there's other movies happening. There's the Israelite movie that you guys are the heroes of. Great. I understand. But if you switch a different channel, there's, as the prophet says, there's Egypt, my people. There's Assyria, the work of my hands. So God has a different relationship, and so much so that there's other prophets that I'm having a relationship with. Well, as long as you keep yourself oriented, you do not have to be worried about getting affected by them. Of course,
Yeah, I thought that was really good, and it's about kind of the proper orientation. And then you talk about Balaam wanted to curse them, but it came out on a blessing because what he was looking on, like the order was correct. I also think I think Paul's talking about kind of the pluralism that comes up in this little corner, and I totally agree with Hezi. Like, it's important for us to talk across faith traditions and, quite frankly, across Christianity, because we have very different viewpoints on things. And so I think all that conversation is great, and is good. And I think you can have those conversations, yet I think, again, this traditional versus the meta-modern Christianity, you can have these conversations. And also what I love what Hezi's talking about, God is out there working in all sorts of places and spaces. And yet there is this space, as Hezi's talking about within his Judaism, there is this proper orientation and direction that he has in terms of that. I think that's kind of one of the biggest challenge for us as Christians. I think the thing we can talk about is our struggles are are we all properly oriented? I think that's probably the question. I think if you'd ask each one of us individually, depending on where we're at or where we're persuaded, we'd say yes. But there is a proper orientation, and it can be as simple as you can just say, well, we're all oriented towards Christ, and that could be it. That's a mere Christianity thing. I think that can work. Were other things revealed to us, or so on and so forth. I find that interesting. I have this deep, but again, since I've immersed myself in orthodoxy, and I've experienced all those other things and had the struggles and the amazing things that happened to me on my journey and my walk to where I ended up there. I don't want to do that. It's hard to explain. I don't have the words for it, but the patterns and the transformations that are happening to me, participating in what would seem like ancient patterns, traditions, rituals that are passé, that aren't, that don't meet the modern mind, and all those other things. Somehow they're working on me in a deep way and in ways that I can't fully understand. And so when I see this meta modern thing and trying to make that's again, that's the conversation I'd like to jump in and have. Let me get this. I've got, and if any of you have had a chance to see Jonathan Pageau's, he did a talk at Hillsdale College. I think that's what it was called. At any rate, where he talked about the icon of the Last Judgment. And the depth, if you just listen to that hour, the depth of what that icon is, and what it reveals about us and our orientations and how the real world, how things really work, in terms of how we live and move and be, and kind of the both sides, like the left hand and the right hand of God, and all these paradoxes all coming together kind of into one. Like there's that depth that you get there. And then so some of the things, let me share. I'm gonna play a little bit of this with. Come on in, somebody, help me out. I want you guys to help me think through this. I'll play a little of this. This came out last week, and this was a conversation that Jonathan Pageau had at stop screen, present, share screen. Let me do this one, share. This is a conversation that Jonathan Pageau had at the Hellenic College, where he was talking about the icons of Holy Week. It's really interesting. Like, he takes you from Palm Sunday all the way up to Pascha. And he breaks down kind of the depth behind these icons. There's so much, like there's so much there. Like, you can meditate on these things your whole life, really. But it tells us so much about kind of our direction. And if you think about and again, I would see iconography in these patterns as timeless. Yes, very traditional, but timeless too. And I don't think you need to be meta-modern with this. But anyway, I'll let me play a little bit of this. Well, hey, Noah's coming in. I'll add Noah in. Let me play a little bit of this from Jonathan Pageau.
The entire mystery of this contradiction, or this clash of extremes, is in its fullest representation. And we have to understand that it took quite a while for Christians to be willing to represent the crucifixion openly. We do have early images of Christ on the cross from the 5th century. Usually there's an image on the door of Santa Sabina, very schematic, and there's also we have an ivory box from the 5th century. But it's not very, and they're struggling again with the problem. How do we do this? The first images, so here's a 6th century image of the crucifixion from the Rabula Gospel. How do we represent this? And people are struggling with reason to know how to represent this deep mystery that is happening. And so the earliest representations of Christ, what they will do is they will show him on the cross with his eyes open and wearing a regal vestment, wearing a kind of royal vestment to cover his nakedness. And you can kind of understand why they're doing that, because what do we just represent him naked? Is that what we're supposed to do? How do we deal with this problem of the cross? Because it is, we're so used to seeing crosses, we're so used to seeing crucifixes that we forget how scandalous this image is. It is so scandalous. Ultimately, what would happen, there are stories of Western Christians coming to Constantinople in, I think, like 10th or 11th century, and witnessing some of the first images where Christ is shown with his eyes closed on the cross and slumped on the cross and being scandalized, like freaking out. How is it that they're doing this? Ultimately, that image would end up being the image that we represent, but we never show people's eyes closed in icons. We don't do that because it means they're dead. Like, we're showing someone who's dead on the cross. And that's a very deep thing. Like, anyways, but on the cross and the image of the cross, we really have all of this coming together, which is that Christ in this image brings together all the stories of the Old Testament, all of these extremes into one. He is the king. It says so on the board above his head, that he is the king. He is lifted up. He's lifted up for all to see, both in glory and in shame. He is returning into the garden. And we know that he's returning into the garden because even in the icon will represent him, like I did, for example, in my version, where you see the two thieves. You see the good thief and the bad thief. And so you see Christ on the tree, discerning good and evil, right? That's what he's doing. And his nakedness is both the nakedness of the garden, but also the nakedness of shame, which comes after the fall. It's like it's a weird clash of all the images together. He kind of brings it together in one moment. And of course, there are all these things that we could show in a crucifixion, but we have chosen mostly to show the Mother of God and St. John at his side. And why? Like, why are we doing that? There are probably plenty of reasons, but one of the reasons is that this is the beginning of the church, right? The church is being born in the moment that Christ is closing his eyes. And so the world, St. Maximus goes way further than I dare. St. Maximus says Christ is creating the world on the cross. And so when they pierced his side and the water and the blood came out, it is the water of the garden.
Okay, you get the point. The depth of all of that, and again, if you watch that video, he talks about the icons the whole week. He then goes in and talks about the icon where it's the emptying of Hades, and there's this amazing thing that comes forth in Orthodoxy, which I never saw, which is at that same moment that he's there and he's died, he's also down. Let me show this one. And then there's this icon. At the same time, he's going down, grabbing Adam and Eve by their wrist and freeing the captives, and restoring them and rescuing them. So, at any rate, Noah, that's this long setup. Seems like you have the answer for me of this is seeming interesting paradox of this traditional shift that we're seeing, and yet we're entering this meta-modern conversation, how those two things, how that phenomenon's coming together, how I can make sense of that paradox.
Yeah, can you hear me, by the way? Okay, cool. I have a few thoughts. I think one of them, and this is kind of where my conversations have been around lately. One side of it is there's three ways of understanding history. There's the random, the cyclical, and the linear. This idea that the linear is the progressive move. It's the one that we're always kind of getting better, and we're just making improvements. And maybe there's a little bit of weirdness in the middle, but you're always kind of progressing a specific direction. The random is just, it's all senseless. Who cares? It's all just random events. And then cyclical being we're coming back, and we're seeing cycles in generations, and we're all going to end up in the same place we came from. And if you hold to any particular one, it's not super interesting. But I think the combination of the cyclical and the linear, I think, is kind of where we're at, where we're seeing this movement, but in the process, we're also seeing the cycles of how the tradition kind of reintegrates into the grander system. And so I think that's a piece of it. And that's kind of how I see a lot of this traditional move, is trying to correct what we already see is missing, and trying to bring it back into whatever we're at. Because you can't abandon where you're standing completely, but you can recognize where we're lacking, and kind of try to move back and forth.
Yeah, Luke talks about, a lot of people talk about the spiral dynamics, like but you're never ending up at the same place, right?
Yep.
However, there's this, I think potentially, and I don't know if I can think about it. I think potentially we stray a little bit too far, and we need to recover things that, like I know people say you can't go back, and you can't go back. However, and I think Peterson did this great job in his biblical series, and as he talked about in that clip with Christian, is about how he basically says, okay, I'm going to build a path for you guys. Here's evolutionary psychology, and I'm going to bring it into the biblical sense, and I'm going to give you this path to see how this works. Like, I'm going to give you a path into this thing. Now, he just gives you the path, and then you end up going to a church of your choice, right? Which is how it should work, right? Because he's not creating a church or so on and so forth. And the thing that I struggle with is, I know you can't go back. However, if there are actual patterns that God has revealed that we need, and we've lost them, that's not going back. That's coming into the revelation of what these patterns that God wants us to participate in. So I would draw out something like simple, like I would think about this. We've lost fasting in the West. Yet we all know, when we read our Bibles, we talked about this when I was in seminary, Jesus didn't say if we fast, but when we fast. We actually had a conversation about that. Like, this was in 2009. We're like, why aren't we fasting? Like, so then we started doing some fastings on Fridays or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, there's these things that are right in front of us. Like, there are these spiritual practices and axioms that we have gone so far away from. And so that, that's a simple one to point out, right? What do you think about that?
No, I agree. I think I'm along similar lines as you. I think it's you can literally go to the same church that was around before, but you can't experience the same Christianity as it was entirely. It's always going to be affected by whatever you've experienced, but you can incorporate what was there into a grander understanding. And that's where I think this idea of unity and diversity is really helpful. The image and revelation of every tribe still speaking their own language, but yet all praising God together. I think that's really valuable. And that's kind of what metamodernism, I think, should be pointed to, is this image of that God is bringing everything to its full potential, but isn't making it the same.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where I'm sitting. I don't know if that fully relates to what you're thinking through.
Yeah, and Sherry asked this great question: are we moving closer to final participation? And I think the answer is, we have Kairos and Chronos. I think that we're always moving closer to the final participation in some ways, right? In the Chronos, but in the Kairos, like what Jonathan Pajot just talked about here, and I hadn't really. I'm sure this has been talked about. I just probably am not well read enough in Protestant circles. Sam just had a conversation with an Anglican priest, and she was talking about this concept of time or whatever. So, I think a lot of people think, in some scandalous things, the cross is actually the Genesis. Like, that's the Genesis moment. And we can't think that, like, that everything reverberates out from that moment. And quite frankly, when I finally kind of contemplated that makes a heck of a lot. Actually, it makes a heck of a lot of sense, is when you try and break the frame. But we have to break these frames. Like, we have to break out of these linear frames, right? How God's moving and acting, which is so hard that's not the way out. I'm just going to tell you, and that wasn't, like, I wasn't brought up to really think that way. That wasn't my normal, natural teaching that I received in Methodism or evangelicalism. That's not. It was very much a linear move, right? And we're coming to this end times, and really the most important thing was, and this was like my wife and I talked about this, whatever, was, hey, the most important thing is you make this decision so you don't go to hell at the end of your life. That kind of is that's the natural, normal kind of thinking thing. But that gets you on that linear thing. And you're talking about, I think there are these cycles and these things, but I think there's something even more mystical and hard for us to understand in all of that.
Yeah. Well, and I think the one verse that kind of gets stuck in my head, and I keep thinking about it, is the lamb slain at the beginning of the world. This idea that there's something ultimately timeless about the crucifixion, that it wasn't something. It was not only a specific event that happened in history, but it's also something universal. And so having to capture both the particular and universal that's going on all at once is, I think, is key to Christianity. One chapter of Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton is all about the paradoxes of Christianity. And he talks about how some will say it's like a person too fat, and then another person will say, someone else will say it's too skinny. It's either a monster that has really skinny parts and really fat parts, or it's actually perfectly shaped, and we all need to be conformed to it.
Mm-hmm. Noah, what's your what context are you in right now? What I know you mentioned. I just want to. What sort of a church context are you in right now?
Yeah, I go to a church that is Assemblies of God, but It doesn't like to call itself Assemblies of God.
We hate labels anymore, don't we?
Well, there's a lot of bad experiences people have had with the denomination, and so they don't want to have to deal with that, and I understand that. And so it's easier to maintain those connections, but not wear the label outright, and be able just to encounter people however you can.
Oh, Hezi, wait a minute. I need to get Hezi in here. Hezi, I'm gonna do this. You might have just joined. I'm gonna pick your brain. I played some clips from you from Christian Baxter. Maybe you can, if you have time, I'd like to parse that out a little bit. Particularly, you were talking about the need for an update, and I kind of want to see what you kind of mean by that within a. To me, I think you're not talking about a liturgical change. I think you're probably talking about a way of seeing and viewing certain things potentially. But I'd love to see if you could join in and talk about that. Okay, so my experience, my aunt and uncle, actually the most powerful spiritual woman I've known in my life is my aunt, and she had a very powerful experience. Quite frankly, her really powerfully coming to know God and living in the Holy Spirit actually transformed our entire family on my dad's side. She was the first one in the 70s. Marriage was struggling. She had this prayer. She just reached out to Christ, had this amazing experience. From that moment forward, I'll be honest, she's been a very faithful woman and a powerhouse. And shortly after that, my dad got sober. We ended up getting back to church. My aunts, who were, probably just unchurched, then started going to church and so on and so forth. And so, but they were in an Assemblies of God church. So I'm familiar with that. Now, there were some weird things that came out. Like you said, there were some weird things and lots of church split ups. Quite frankly, they've lived through or whatever. She's meandered her way because it can get, charismatic churches can get a little off the rails from time to time.
Yeah, and I think. Oh, hey, Michael.
Morning, Michael.
Morning. No, I was going to share something, so I don't want to interrupt.
All right, I can just do this, and then you can take over. But yeah, I think there's one thing that's been really a blessing is that I live really close to a university, and so having the church is very much geared towards how do we address these people, like these young people who have a lot of questions about the faith, and so they're very on top of like making sure that that they're being challenged and that like they're making room for these type of questions, because sometimes I think there's a problem with a lot of the charismatic stuff is that it's very anti-intellectual sometimes, or you'll go down that route, and so it's this kind of correcting where I think the biggest weaknesses are, where it creates something that's as strong as possible, and that's been really good for me.
When Paul talks about immanentization, which is really true, he's starting to work on his PowerPoint. Paul, I have a corresponding PowerPoint I'm working on too. Maybe we'll talk back and forth with our PowerPoints. But the one thing that I love about the charismatics is it's very immanent. I mean, God is present doing things all the time. It's the whole everywhere present filling all things in a charismatic church. Oh man, it is. So hey, Michael, what do you have to share?
Well, I've been thinking about this thing a lot. Both the return to tradition and because I had some early thoughts about the whole meta-modern thing, and I approached it much more from a conservative viewpoint, almost to consider like how are people in the more fundamentalist type churches or whatever. Because I worked for 15 years at an AG church that also did not let people know it was Assemblies of God. It was pretty tame. You had to really stay there a long time to find the zany parts. So I mean, it was a good thing. But but I was thinking about the thing because obviously, like Brendan, he's approaching it from this thing of it's like he's living in the world of the secular materialist academia, and he's trying to expand that frame to allow a return to faith. But within on the other end of the spectrum, you have these churches that have good-hearted Christian people who love God, but it's only within that limited understanding where it's like they're going out on the street corner with their King James English on their signs, and telling people to repent or whatever. It's like that just doesn't even mean anything to like the average person. So you have to have this thing. this kind of pluralist thing. And I think maybe the thought as I was listening to from the start that came up was that you kind of need to have like three things at least to kind of make any kind of comparison, because you have people that like grow up in one church setting, maybe like evangelical, and then they go out in the world and they deconstruct, because when they're comparing those two, they see the binary, and what they see is like everybody just lives the same way. Like nothing looks different. These people live all the same way, but they don't believe in God and they're doing just fine. And, you know, you probably would have debates about it, whether that's actually the case or not. But, you know,
I've heard that 1,000 times if I've heard it 1 time.
That's the thing. And then when you introduce this third thing, which is like a more traditional form of Christianity, it just causes that thing where you have to reassess everything, that you thought you knew about Christianity. And, you know, I think the value in that, I'm not so much like, I found out I have some weird personality traits that kind of contribute to this. But like when people just talk about like the majesty and the dignity and all that stuff, like sometimes that hits people, and I get that, and that's a thing. But I think that it's just really the most valuable thing is that it gives you that contrast where now you have to compare, okay, wait, so this is clearly different from me and my secular life, which people, you know, they go and they experience it and they find out it doesn't work. But it's also different from my evangelical upbringing, but there's similarities there, you know. So there's there's, you know, and I think hopefully my hope especially is that people, you know, when people get into some new tradition and they're really excited about it and then they want to bring their parents in, I think the best thing would be to understand, oh, now that I've experienced Catholicism or Orthodoxy or Anglicanism, and I've learned the liturgy and the symbols, now I understand why all the stuff that you did at the megachurch was meaningful to you, because the meanings are still there. They're just disguised by like the modern aesthetic. So that's probably enough to throw out there for the moment.
I think Noah. I think that's really good, Michael. Like, because, you know, if I was talking to a lot of millennials in the mid to late 2000s, right, in the early 2000s, and that exact thing you talked about, which is people aren't living any differently here than I see out there. You heard that, and I know a lot of people push back against this word, but it's the word they use. Like if you go back and actually read, like what you would hear were authentic, right? You haven't heard Jordan Peterson talk about that word, which is authentic, and I think it's this, and that's why I think to some extent, and I know this pushes buttons on certain people the wrong way. I think the seeker and relevance church thing, I think that's going to be a thing of the past. I think trying to have the coffee shop and the lowest bar possible to get people in and making it look as much of the world as possible and as comfort and no barriers or whatever. Like, I just think that's such a new phenomenon in Christianity. It's really new. Like that's really when you talk about really the past 30 years or, 40, like that's such a new development. And a lot of people that I see there, if you listen to deconstruction stories, or if you spent time, like, having spent time in ministry, I know you have too. And if you deal with people like that's such a big thing. And I think, like you say, people coming in and then seeing these things that are not of this world, right? That aren't seeker, that aren't relevant, that are very traditional or whatever. And then there is a lot of depth and all those things there. I think that's like, oh, okay. That helps solve that thing that I was having. By the way, and this is shocking, I know, there are cultural Orthodox Christians that just might show up a few times a year for the important holy days. They're not practicing any sort of prayer life or whatever, they're not following the fast, and they're secular Orthodox Christians. Like that thing exists in there too, right? Yeah. So it's not that's the universal thing of the Christian, the narrow path and the wide road, right?
Yeah. Well, that's, and I think that's a big problem. This is the big problem that I see that really needs to change for all traditions is just how much we have really accepted like the secular sacred divide, because it doesn't, because if you can be a church, it doesn't matter what kind of church you go to, if you leave church at church and you separate church from every other aspect of your life. So like, because I would say rather than having like the coffee shop in the church, the Christians need to have the coffee shop that is just a coffee shop, but it's filled with Christians, and the Christians are friendly to the people that are there. And then, and then you have that thing, and then the church that they invite somebody to could be an Orthodox church, or it could be an evangelical church. That's not what matters, because that's where the, the thing of like that you are canvassing the neighborhood and inviting people in, like you only ever are going to get a certain type of people, the type of people that show up to things when people invite them. But you let so many, and I think because you get high numbers from at a certain level from that movement, it seems like it's this great success, but you're totally ignorant of the people that you're missing because you're totally off the radar. It's just like,
no, I think it's always going to be the case that a small few are going to become disciples, right? Because we see that in Jesus. I mean, Jesus only could get a small few to be disciples, and then so I think that's because it's hard, right? Because the life is hard, and it's been hard every generation. It was hard for them to not participate in the festivals and eat the meat, and effectively they would have to break off relationships with family, right? Like that was very much talked about in the New Testament, and so on and so forth. And one of the things, and I knew it, you probably know it too, if you've been behind the scenes, I had became friends and knew guys who were heads of like fairly large kind of maybe small megas or whatever. What they kept realizing was like we could get a crowd to come through here, but actually we're really just shuffling the deck chairs. We're just getting people from other churches that are wanting to come, and then the large amount of people for the most part, every pastor's hope is to call people in deeper into the life. They want you to get into a small group. They really want you to get into a one-on-one discipleship relationship. They want your life to get up in the morning, in the Protestant sense, get up, get in the Word, get into prayer, start to tithe, like all this stuff, like start living the life, because they know that's where that's what Jesus called us to do, is follow me. You know what I mean? And so that is that heart. But you see someone like Francis Chan did this at Simi Valley. He walked away from the church because he was pulling thousands in every weekend, but you could see him preaching towards the end. He's like, guys, you're not doing it. And then he just kind of realized it. Paul had that conversation. I can't remember his name, the guy who left the mega church, and then he was, whatever, because he would, there's this thing that's happening where they're realizing that this thing seems to, we're putting a lot of butts in the seats, but we're not calling people kind of deeper into the life. So again, like that thing exists. And I think I find this, and so again, what do you, when people start talking, I see all this stuff talked around or whatever, when you hear people talking about meta modern, I see some people in the comments, I probably should do a better job. When I watch the comments, I don't listen to the people talking, and I want to hear you so I find I miss things or whatever. So I was really trying to just listen to you. When you hear meta modern, what are you hearing? I get this sense that it's almost a move away from the traditional, yet we're seeing this other, you know what I mean? When you hear meta modern, what do you think, Mike?
Like I said, I kind of worked on my own concept of that, of this. And I think it's really hard because, what you're saying, you're saying that it's like a worldview, as far as I can see, it's supposed to be bigger. It's supposed to be more all encompassing. It's everything so take everything that like modernism reduced, everything that it got away with, tradition, the supernatural, all the whatever. And then, the postmodern thing would validate some of that stuff, but it was always in the just like it's just because it works for you or whatever. It didn't have any weight to the reality of it, or it was just about your own experiences. And the way I see it is kind of like, okay, we just have to put all the cards back on the table. Like, because when we kept trying to make a worldview by pulling things off that didn't make sense, we end up with nihilism. And so I think, you have to kind of put all the cards back on the table. So, like, I think that's why I see like all the value in all the different traditions. And even like I was even just thinking about this, like, when you have the Reformation happen, it's like clearly the Catholic Church was doing some things wrong, and then there's the reformers that are protesting that. But then you also have this group of Anabaptists, and they were not, and some of them were off the rails, but then some of them were they were pointing to some really important truths that both sides were missing. And like Malcolm and Simone, they just had a video yesterday, I think, came out, where they were answering the question of like, is there any groups that you don't want to, like, that you don't want people, because they're all about having more babies. Like, is there any groups that you don't want to grow or don't? And basically they said, we have to like fight for the right for everybody to try to preserve their culture. Like, otherwise, eventually we are going to be the ones that if we try to eliminate anyone, at some point we're going to be the ones that people are trying to eliminate. And so, and which I'm like, okay, well, this is a very like Anabaptist thing. It's like, I will not fight you. I will put up my arms. If you want to, come in here and do harm against us, like, that's on you. We're not going to, we'll run away, but we're not going to fight you back. And, because eventually, that does have an effect, like, of disarming people. It diffuses anger when people surrender. Obviously, it's Christ-like, but if you took that element out, it's like, how long could the Protestants and the Catholics just have fought against each other? So you always need a third person on the outside to kind of have a functioning society. So I think the metamodern is allowing people to reconsider a lot of their binaries, and hopefully it leads to people getting along and seeing the value in a lot of these other traditions.
Yeah, one of the things that probably is wrong for me, and I'd be curious if people who would describe it this way, if metamodern means seeker irrelevant, then I know that won't work. You know what I mean? You know what I mean by that? We're just trying, okay, what's going on in the culture? How do we need to arrange things so maybe we can attract more people? Like that thing. Because again, I think the really interesting thing in someone here said this seems kind of churchy. Yeah, it is kind of churchy, but I'm a church nerd. I'm the guy who watched every minute of the CRC Synod last summer. So yeah, this is one of those streams. It's okay, we can talk about it. But I lost track of where I was heading on that.
Seeker irrelevant.
Yeah, what's really happening, what Father Danek was talking about in the Antiochian church, and I've seen it because I've been in 3 different cities and I've seen the phenomenon, right? Which is, they had no programs. They changed nothing that they were doing. They didn't try and seek new people to come into their churches, right? And then all of a sudden, people are flooding, and new people are flooding in their doors, right? And so there was no seeker relevant move. And I again, being inside, I understand what that thing is. Like we talked about, like, okay, what kind of programs can we have, right? How do we market this way? Hey, we're going to do this thing, and then each one of you are going to go and invite 3 or 4 friends in, and we're going to have this special series. So think about friends who are like this. Like, that's the sort of stuff we talked about inside baseball, like within churches. And none of that has happening in these Orthodox churches, and they're seeing this surge into it. People are just finding it, right? Which is which is so when I think about the meta modernity or meta modern Christianity, I know that that thing is not the thing that's happening, or at least I don't think that. And so, maybe and that's why I'm happy you guys are coming in to help me kind of understand this, because I think ultimately what we're really all pressing into is what God's revelation, heavens declare our glory, right? Like we God is speaking to us through nature, through all sorts of things. He's speaking, he's drawing, and these revelations have been around, you know, for us as Christians, being foreshadowed, foretyped, and then fulfilled in the person of Christ, right? And so we're not trying to learn about things, we're trying to learn about a person, right? And those sorts of things. And so I don't think that changes. Giving us an on-ramp like Jordan Peterson, like we need to help people point people or help them. Like Sherry likes to put people, like she talks about, she likes to stand people on the top of their heads and ask questions with a little slant to get people thinking. It's trying to point people in a direction, which I think Jordan Peterson did. And then ultimately, this is just me thinking, at the end of We Agnostics to Alcoholics Anonymous says, when we drew near to him, he disclosed himself to us. Like it's just the seeking, and then God does the disclosing. Like the Holy Spirit does the revealing, like all that stuff happens, right? Welcome, Sherry. Welcome, Christian. Welcome, Just Michael. You guys jump in. Let me know what you think.
Well, I just wanted to ask a quick question and see what you guys think, because when I was like, I haven't really listened to the meta modern conversation, and neither am I coming out of an evangelical background, you know, really. I mean, I know it, you know, I'm familiar. I went to the Toronto Blessing. I went to the church in Toronto. But here's the question, because I've had the experience of culture shock. And so when you guys were talking, it dawned on me, and I just thought maybe I'd ask this question and see what you think. I'm wondering how much of this, you know, because you what do you have your thing titled? Traditional shift. Trying to make sense of the traditional shift and what we think is modern, right? Like, because we don't think of modern as being traditional, right? So that we have this paradoxical thing happening. And I'm trying to think of how to frame this. The world has become more global, right? More homogenous. People are moving around and moving into cultures that they were never part of before. And those cultures are meeting each other sometimes for the first time, you know, individuals within the culture. And if anyone's had the experience of traveling to another country, they often encounter their own axioms. That's the first thing that was my experience, right? They get to this other country and they go, why do I believe that when I can see something else happening here that is just as good or just as efficient or whatever it might be, right? And so I'm wondering how much of, let's say, because I think this is happening in the context of America or North America, I wonder how much of that culture is encountering itself for the very first time and realizing that it actually has a cultural form of Christianity, right? And that it's not just what it thought was a global kind of Christianity, that every Christian is this, and every Christian believes that, and every Christian does this, and every Christian goes to this kind of church. It's realizing that its world has suddenly become very small and very, very culture dependent, right? It's a Christianity that grew out of a certain political, philosophical, even religious. Like, I mean, if you look at the first people that came to America, you know, they had very, you know, certain dogmatic beliefs about their Christianity. And then the other thing that came to my mind, Lance, was having read the story The Castle by George MacDonald. In the castle is this huge family, right, of brothers and sisters. But all they're doing in the beginning is competing with one another. They're snarky with each other. They know they're family, but they're still, not great. And I was just looking for a passage here. I'm going to look for it, and then maybe, I don't want to dump too much on you all at once, but what do you think of that, what I just said? And I'll find this thing that I wanted to read here.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that, because one of the things that I think is a seminal thing, well, I can speak for myself, but I've talked to a lot of people who are coming into just my context orthodoxy. We had no idea that it existed, really, because like, my seminary was just cleaned over. Most seminaries, like, I had no idea this thing existed that was, you know, very different than Catholicism in a lot of ways, right? And all of a sudden, I was exposed to this thing, and it was very different. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think that, you know, when I watch a YouTube about some kind of new, very, very modern, you know, big box evangelical church, like people that are into technology, a lot of those churches are very integrated with technological practice, with the use of computers and everything. And they'll say things like, you know, in the church. They'll say that, and y'all probably know what I'm talking about if you've been exposed to, like, Lance, I know you do, probably Michael, you probably do too. It's like, in the church, you know, we do blah, blah, blah. And then if you listen to the Catholics talk, they'll be like, in the church. But they're talking about two completely different cultures within the church when they say those things. But they're using like a universal term, like, and I would say something along the lines of, like, because when Robert Barron Bishop Barron's talking about the church, he's more or less talking about the Catholic Church. You know, he probably has a little bit broader of a context, knowing that he's got, you know, millions of people watching on YouTube, but for the most part, that's the language that's used. And I think something like this, the perspective of something meta is, and I think meta has something to do with like going through, or, you know, through modernism, through postmodernism, through the moderns, and then you look back at all, you look back at it all, and you are evaluating it, and not, and Sherry mentioned something about like the snark related to that, and that's kind of what, a little bit, when people say this, the church, they're not saying it in a snarky way, but it is kind of like a myopic perspective when that term is used, because a lot of times it's Baptist and evangelicals talking about Baptist and evangelical things, or it's Orthodox talking about Orthodox things, or it's Catholics talking about Catholic things. Yeah. And so, and postmodernism, and Michael hit on this, would be like looking at these things, and they're relativized, and then he mentioned it going down into nihilism from there, or, you know, or deconstructing. I would say that there's usually like a political stop before the nihilism that you drop into, because it's like, oh, all these things, because they're relative, then that means that they lose all meaning. And then now, okay, the only thing that really matters is politics and power. But then if you play that game for long enough, you realize, oh man, this really sucks. And then you're depressed. And so, so I think that the meta modern thing is like, well, all these things are important, actually. And just because you can say something like Noah's story and the story of Gilgamesh might actually be the same thing, doesn't actually mean that one is that they're both equally relative. One of them might have actually immense more meaning in the world. And we can objectively say, at least in the world that we live in, that the story of Noah has had much more effective meaning specifically in the West, than Gilgamesh, than the story of Gilgamesh. Even if the modern view would say, oh, historically, these things are the same thing and they're a historical myth based off each other. So then you go bump into this postmodern pluralistic relativistic thing. It's like, okay, well, that just means because they're the same, then that means that they're relative and that there's actually there's no inherent meaning. They're just a story. But then if you go past that, you're like, actually, I'm looking at both of these things and I'm looking at the world. I'm looking at all these things together. And actually, I can point to something that I think actually holds a lot more meaning, maybe to me as an individual, but you could also say maybe culturally at large or in a certain segment of civilization. And so I think that would be an example of how you take the meaning from different things that modernism would have created relativism, and then be like, well, how do we get through that? And I think the thing that Brendan, he's saying there's a religion past that, metamodern religion, not metamodern Christianity. He's saying there's a religion past that where everything is then encapsulated into a whole truth. And if you're a Christian in this stream or a monotheist in this stream, then you could say, and then you wouldn't say that necessarily that as a religion, but you might say that as metamodern Christianity, which I think is, or metamodern monotheism, I would say is kind of a pretty big pattern in this corner space that we inhabit. So that's something.
I want to push on something though that you just said, Christian. Right, which is that there's this. I think when Brendan talks about this, I haven't listened to all the different conversations he's had at PLC, but from the ones I've heard so far, it's the fundamental assumption that there's this form of universal religion or philosophy, whatever you want to call it, that is best for all human beings, which I think really comes out of a very originally Greek and then later Christian idea. I think that's something that we're gonna have, for instance, like I as an Orthodox Jew have a huge tension with, because like our goal is never to convert the whole world to one religion, and like the biggest container is not necessarily the best container. In some ways, like the secular space is invented so that different religions can get along without killing each other. Right, secular in the modern sense, not in the Catholic sense, obviously. But like, right, we create the secular space like post, the wars of religion, and all that, so that we can get along. It doesn't mean that the secular space that is more devoid of religion is better in any way. It just means that we don't kill each other. Similarly, I've heard this, like, we can talk about like democracy is like a terrible form of government, but
Oops.
Joseph was cooking.
We
Yeah,
should just be happy we have him at all, like that he even joined the stream. You know what I
I
mean?
know.
Exactly. So Hezi,
glad.
what sparked this? I've been thinking about it, and Christian shared a clip this morning, and I really enjoyed your entire conversation you guys had. But he shared the clip this morning of Hezi, and it seemed to me you were talking about. Now I know that probably Jacob and Joseph probably wouldn't agree with some of the stuff, but you talked about Judaism being this great operating system, but in need of an update, right? Which I know that touches certain buttons in certain people and amongst your other Jewish friends may not agree with that. In a way, so here's the question I have: are you speaking towards a meta-modern Judaism? I don't necessarily think you are. I was trying to understand what you were talking about. That the other thing that I was thinking about too is that when you talked about the story about Balaam, and then he looked and he was going to curse, but then it only came out of a blessing because it was, ordered the right way and everything else. When you're talking about this, I don't think you're talking about really any liturgical changes or anything like that within Judaism. I think you're speaking about something else, but I'll let you speak for yourself. But, I titled this Meta-Modern Christianity. I should have just said, meta-modern religion or whatever, so I can bring you in, because I think you're thinking about this a lot.
First off, hello all. I hope you're all doing well.
Hi, Gilly.
So yeah, I do think about this a lot. there's different aspects to it. There's different levels to it, but I would say that some of the tensions, let's say that Jacob or even Yosef have, I think, with me are I am considering liturgical / halachic changes. Well, let's just take a step back for a second, just with regards to the framing. The reason I think this conversation, in my estimation, becomes very relevant is, to me, this relates to the advancement of AI and technology, and I just think so many separations and narratives were shattered because of technology. And this conversation we're having right now is evident of that, right? We're all having a conversation over here with, in theory, different denominations within Christianity and talking to a Jew right now. And the fact that we are even having a conversation about metamodernism, that means we're all aware now of psychology and metaphysics and biology. So,
Yeah.
and as that becomes, this is not to be political at all, but just using the example of even the war going on in Israel right now, the fact that it's on everyone's mind is because everyone has a phone that's showing them all day nonstop, like it's this many dead and this, like we're living in a world that we as humans didn't adjust yet to. Now, with regards to how religions have to look at that, it's very nice that Mr. Metamodern, BGD, is writing his book and giving us this beautiful explanation. By the way, this is no shade on you, please take no offense. But he's giving us his explanation, and that's great, and I'm glad that he's doing that. It's because my fear is, with my son playing on the computer, right, and this is the example I use, that he is suddenly going to witness this, and there's a gap between what the sages or the church fathers were aware of, or they had these tools of interpretation that if they got to some sort of issue, or there was some sort of historical criticism that they needed to deal around, they knew they had their quote unquote tools to move around it. And there was no need to discuss this with the rest of the population because it would be too confusing. It would open up too many questions, and we don't need to go down that route. And the people that knew. As more of this comes to the forefront, it's if we're not educating all the levels of population how to deal with this, if they don't all have this toolkit, then it starts getting very, very complicated. And before I even get to liturgical changes, it does require a mindset shift with regards to how one wants to interpret the Torah. Now, in Judaism, we obviously have this oral Torah, which we also believe we received in Sinai. However, there are different interpretations of, and again, they're small references about when the Torah is being written. Is it being written all in one chunk, or is it being given in different parchments? And these are all elements that allow you to still look at biblical criticism in a certain sense, or look at psychological interpretations of the Bible, like Jordan Peterson is doing, and allow you to give you a roadmap, right? I think I probably even said this exactly to Christian, but allows you to give you a roadmap how to still look at the world through that vision. And both could be true. There's just two different layers of interpretation. But in order to integrate them, you need to be able to say, okay, I could hold a concept in my head of Adam and Eve as two meta truths. I could also walk with my son in the Natural History Museum and look at the bonobos and be like, that is also a truth. And both are teaching me different things. I'm looking at them differently also. When I'm in prayer, I have one conversation. I'm not thinking about the bonobos and Adam's conversation, right? When I'm talking about Adam and Prometheus and him playing with the rocks, right? That is a concept, right? I don't think the Midrash think that God gave Adam two rocks, but it's a concept that is true enough for us to live our life based on that. And it is true in a sense where it shouldn't affect one's religious underpinnings. However, it does require, and I say about like an operating system, one that needs to be updated, it does require tweaks. You do need to add different language. You need to give some jargon. You need to point out some sources that allow you to realize to sort of land peacefully. And that is something that can't happen within a second, but it requires educators and parents at some point on-ramping their kids in a certain sense to this this way of thinking. And again, it's giving them tools, because you're not going to avoid your son or your daughter at 10 years old, at 15 years old, coming to you and saying, why is the tabernacle the same measurements of Ramesses II's war camp? And why is Gilgamesh before Moses? And what, like, you're going to have to respond to that. And that's another level happening a little different. But when Joe Rogan is debating with a archaeologist, you know, what is Göbekli Tepe? If it's 12, if the pyramids are really 9,000 years old, then what were we teaching in our texts? Right. So I'm not running to aliens right now, but my point is that we have to realize that these narratives can be integrated. I think Judaism does and has many, many sources and tools which allows it to do so. There, of course, is political, emotional ramifications to this, which I completely understand. I always use this. Well, I used it there before, so I won't go there. Where this spins to liturgical is a different topic, but I might have said too much and rambled too much. So I hope that was understandable, and forgive me if that was too long.
Can I just jump in here with with what I wanted to read, because it's so pertinent to this conversation and the beauty and you know, I know that you guys like to talk about the details, and you know, I like it in the form of a story, because the story is not it's just it's way more digestible and palatable, and it can trickle a little bit. But I just want to give you a little background in case you haven't heard it. So there's a castle and there's a family living in it, and the father is not there. Okay. There's an older sister and an older brother. Think Adam and Eve in this case. And the rest of the family is you know, doing their own thing. There are some certain rules in the house that they have to obey. There's rooms they're not allowed to go into unless the father is there. And they've been waiting for the father for centuries, and he's just not showing up. And so they finally take the younger ones, they bind up the older brother and they throw him down in the cellar. And the older sister's kind of got her head in the clouds half the time, and she's not paying much attention. And then they throw a big party in one of these great halls where they're not supposed to be, okay, without the father. And they invite people, they throw out leaflets, actually. They throw out leaflets and just tell everyone in the surrounding area to just show up, right? So they do this. In the middle of their party, the brother emerges from the basement because this huge storm has happened. And somehow his chains are loosed, and he comes up from the basement, and he just shows up in the room, and everybody just runs like they're terrified. The windows blow open, the wind is coming in, it's raining, all their silly decorations are getting ruined, right? And they basically like what's left are the family, and they repent. They just lay on their faces on the ground, and they don't know, they have nothing to say. And then he says, okay, let's go. Come on, let's get up. But don't close the windows in this great hall. We have to let the wind and the rain purge it, which is symbolic of the Holy Spirit and God and blessing and so on. So I'm going to start there. So it says here, the rain fell continuously, though not heavily, without and within. There were clouds from which dropped the tears, which are the rain of the Spirit. All the good of life seemed for the time departed, and their souls lived but as leafless trees that had forgotten the joy of summer, and who no wind prophetic of spring had yet visited. They moved about mechanically and had not strength enough left to wish to die. This is nihilism, okay? That's what he's describing. And then he says, the next day the clouds were higher, and a little wind blew through such loopholes in the turrets as the false improvements of the inmates had not yet filled with glass. So they had not time enough to wall themselves in completely. And through those loopholes, and I like how he uses that word, because I'm thinking actually of Kezi at the moment when I say that, you know, these loopholes, the wind begins to blow, right? Through the loopholes. Think about it. What are the loopholes? And then it says, the wind blew fresher through the loopholes and the shattered windows of the great rooms and found its way by unknown passages to faces and eyes hot with weeping. It cooled and blessed them. And then it says, by degrees, everything fell into the regularity of subordination. With the subordination came increase of freedom. So like, this is what repentance does, right? It's metanoia. It's a change it's an evolution of consciousness. And with that kind of subordination comes increase of freedom. The steps of the more youthful of the family were heard on the stairs and in the corridors, more light and quick than ever before. And then he goes into a description of what, you know, everyone in this family has interests of their own, and they're all pursuing their interests, but they're in competition with each other before this happens. Now, they're suddenly, first of all, they're loving more their interest. They're loving more what they are doing. And he describes one of the brothers who's an astronomer, right? And so I'll just read this paragraph. One of the brothers, for instance, was very fond of astronomy. He had his observatory on a lofty tower, which stood pretty clear of the others, towards the north and east. But hitherto his astronomy, as he called it, had been more of the character of astrology. Often, too, he might have been seen directing a heaven-searching telescope to catch the rapid transit of a fiery shooting star belonging altogether to the earthly atmosphere and not to the serene heavens. He had to learn that the signs of the air are not the signs of the skies. Nay, once his brother surprised him in the act of examining through his longest tube a patch of burning heath upon a distant hill. But now he was diligent from morning till night in the study of the laws of the truth that has to do with stars. And when the curtain of the sunlight was about to rise from the heavenly worlds, which it had hidden all day long, he might be seen preparing his instruments with that solemn countenance with which it becomes one to look into the mysterious harmonies of nature. Now he learned what law and order and truth are, what consent and harmony mean, how the individual may find his own end in a higher end, where law and freedom mean the same thing, and the purest certainty exists without the slightest constraint. Thus he stood on the earth and looked to the heavens. So he's grounded, but he's also transcendent, right?
Yeah.
So
sorry. I was just.
I just got one more thing, and then I'll be all done. I'm sorry. I just want to get this story condensed as much as I can. So then it says, and this is the one, and they began to discover that they were all meditating different aspects of the same thing. And they brought together their various discoveries and recognized the likeness between them. And the one thing often explained the other, and combining with it helped to a third. They grew in consequence more and more friendly and loving, so that every now and then one turned to another and said as in surprise, "Why, you are my brother. Why, you are my sister." And yet they had always known it.
I think that is a beautiful encapsulation of what's being discussed. I think the struggle is that culture at large and people in this space can like resonate and latch on to that, but at large it's still, I think, to Kezi's point about his son encountering this, even for Brendan Graham Dempsey encountering historical criticism at the age of 13 before he was ready to receive that kind of information. It was really, really painful and difficult for him and what it did. And so Kezi's trying to point to, we have tools to deal with this. And that's a beautiful, artful way of describing a beautiful path towards a type of unity, a type of peace, a type of understanding between people. But with he's saying, like, if my 12-year-old has ChatGPT and then he starts talking to me about historical criticism of and that we aren't caught up yet to that enlightened description of that story. And we need the art to be able to do that. That's a piece of it. We need we also need these kind of spaces. I think Brendan is trying to come in and invite people to that, but also it seemed like in his initial attempts to come into this conversation had a lot to do with the concern that Kezi was kind of hitting on, of people that have been in a nihilistic state, that haven't explored different parts. They find meaning into religion, and then all of a sudden he's worried that their religion is going to collapse again because they then encounter things that maybe either religion haven't been equipped, or they're not in a space to be shepherded or discipled or walked alongside with through very difficult truths about reality. And I would also just say that because of things like artificial intelligence, and the Protestant idea of the priesthood of the believer, that everybody is their own priest. And there was a part in that, in your story, where you was talking about subjecting yourself to an authority, and that if we're all our own authority, and this is part of the place that we find ourselves in this meta space, is you can look at everybody can look at everything all at once, kind of. And at a point that will also drive you crazy, that the more proper orientation in life is to submit yourself to a higher authority, submit yourself to a priest, or or a rabbi, and allow them to help you navigate those things. Even though we have the power to be our own source of all information, but it's not a healthy way to live, and it creates a lot of chaos. I can't remember the part that you in that story was something about having like all the being able to try to understand everything. But anyways, that's part of my ramblings. Wanted to respond to some of Kezi's stuff too on that.
Well, just real quickly, and then I want to hear from other people. But what, like, I emphasized the loophole thing in the story, right? Because and this is the idea of rationality walling us in, right? Like, rationality connects dots. It connects things together. And when we rationalize, we wall ourselves in, because we're literally closing all the holes in, and what the Spirit does in the story is the things that haven't yet been glassed in and walled in and sealed up. And because we don't see them, right? There's no way, like, we'd be like a beaver just constantly running around plugging up our dam, That's where the Spirit blows in. It blows in through those loopholes. And I love how he uses the word loopholes, because we have loopholes. Every belief system has loopholes, right? It has quandaries. It has wrenches. It's got things in it that we're like, yeah, but I thought that, only this many things can be this. But now there's that. And there's this guy. And where does he fit in, right? And it's through those loopholes that the Spirit blows and washes, the tears of repentance are what washes us, right? And the subordination is a subordination to the transcendent, right? And then it results in the subordination to one another. So anyway, I'm going to stop talking, because I just love this story so much for all those reasons.
I hopped in here and I was willing to waste Lance and Mr. Sartori's time, but now there's more people on, so I'm going to try to be sensitive to that. I remember I had a short conversation with Mr. Sartori last year for a little while, and we found ourselves at interesting odds, really based on language. right? And so even listening to this conversation, a lot of the conversations that we have, and we're paying attention to a lot of the same things, but the words that we use, we can't help but ask ourselves, well, what do you mean by that? Right? There's a lot of that going on. So in the vein of story, and I'll try to go through this quickly, I found my own experience, which is probably shades my view a lot when it comes to metamodernism. But my own personal experience leads into something that makes me resonate with this. So I come from a Pentecostal background, deconstruct really hard, hyper-rationalization, end up in the wisps left over of Christianity in these hardcore leftist movements. Some of you guys know about the Occupy stuff. So full deconstruction. So Christians pointing earlier, here's these groups, and they're talking about the church, but they're really talking about their own little in-groups and out-groups, right? They're broken off into their own little segments. So there's a multiplicity of things. And then you further deconstruct, right? And then you're ending up like deeper and deeper into chaos in the waters, into multiplicity, and which inevitably leads to death, right? It's the extent of being completely in the waters, swallowed by the monster. And then there's if I take that, and then I also go, well, modernity. There's a nowness to modernity. There's a focusing on what's present and in the current, right? So then all of a sudden, right, once you reach death, maybe you're reaching beyond, because now you're having to encounter what does rebirth look like if you're dealing with death, right? So now you're in the now, you're in the present, but you're looking towards the beyond, the meta, right? The post-death, right? There's an intersection of all those things. And to me, that's where I see the kind of work from Daniel Boyarin, from Father Stephen DeYoung, from Peterson, right? These parallels, right? Pointing at the kind of stuff that seemingly things like the Book of Enoch point out, which is like a contending with the Son of Man, right? And to even be sensitive to that is sort of like a weird left-right hemisphere reintegration, which can really only happen, to Sherry's point, in submission, right? Where you're no longer deconstructing into your multiplicity of your little in-groups and out-groups, but you're subjected to one very real reality, right? And that the only way to not be in rebellion to that is to hear and do the will of the Son of Man, which means encountering that. And so I think that being in the now and participating in creation and redeeming creation in the Son of Man is well, how do you take now and instead of hyper focus on traditionalism, and we have to return to something old or maintain these practices or this, it's what is eternal in the invisible, in the beyond, in submission to the Son of Man. And I think that the art for metamodernism sort of reflects this, right? A reaching back out to the invisible, right? And a contending with, okay, well, here's this hyper-rationalism and this deconstruction and the death that it's got us to, but now we're reaching back out to beyond. So the thoughts on metamodernism, right, and where we're at, it seems to be the same thing as like a grappling with enchantment. But it's not just that. The assertion made by people like Daniel Boyarin or some parts of the Orthodox Church or what have you is that if there is one unified reality, if there is the church, the invisible church, or like the community, everyone, right? If that's real, then and you're not going to split off into groups and deconstruct again, then it is hearing and doing. It is in submission. So various thoughts. Thanks for letting me talk.
Paul, you got some thoughts?
Oh, I've got a lot of thoughts.
Let's
No,
hear 'em.
I think this has been really helpful. It does touch on, I mean, what Hezi was talking about really touches on the formation aspect that I talked about in this morning's video, in that, you know, every parent deals with this with their child, because I think Sherry, the story nicely shows sort of this dance between the many and the one. I mean, and there's a lot of people who come into the conversation and they say, well, all is one. Well, that's good. But when we live serially through life, you can't live all as one, because here's a person that you trust with these things. Here's a person that you trust with other things. And a child has to figure all of this out. And so, you know, the Christian Reformed Church has these forms of subscription, and the assumption is that the whole community has been formed by the Heidelberg Catechism. But now it's the case that the formation of the Heidelberg Catechism is this much compared to all of this. And I think Hezi pointed that out very well. Now, there's a commonality between Hezi dealing with how to raise his children within Judaism and Christian Reformed people trying to raise their children within the Christian Reformed Church. And I think that the Castle story nicely sort of shows, and I think Christian really said it well too, where you realize the pluralism, and then you sort of get pragmatic and you say, okay, well, let's just reduce everything to politics. But that's sort of parallel to the conversation that Nate had with Brandon, whereas, you know, someone might say, well, here you've got two perennialists talking who are really big on all is one. And then, you know, some of the knock that, say, Anselman might give to Grail Country is, oh, there's a whole bunch of perennialists out there in Grail Country and all is one, yada, yada, yada. And then you have another all is one guy come in and bang, what do they trip on almost right away, which was completely predictable if you heard my first conversation with Brendan, which is modernity and miracles. And so, you know, Nate and I are much more in alignment here that the universe is weird. You know, if you a priori dismiss miracles, well, now you're really destroying something that many of these religions have simply assumed all throughout history. And so even, you know, and, you know, when Brendan Dempsey talks, you know, when he names people like Maclaren, I've been down that road. I've read Maclaren's books. I sort of went through this path. And so I think, you know, Christian and Sherry sort of laying out this pathway that people come and you go through, and Michael just did too. And then I like how Michael sort of ended it. At some point, you just begin to say, hey, look, I can't answer everything, but I need to start somewhere because I'm a person. So I'm going to submit to a tradition. And I have reason to believe it's a significant tradition. It's a well thought through tradition. I'm going to begin with a tradition, and all of that other synthesis, I'm going to have to keep working on. And so I'm going to have to figure out Christianity and Judaism and Islam and New Agey stuff. And of course, Hermes pops up, and it's like, oh man, what a quandary we're going to have with good old Hermes now. But this is the path that we are all sort of following, and to get a sense of what's happening in this little corner. So there's a unity to this path that many of us have been following. And I think Christian said it nicely. And I think the Shepherd's Castle said it nicely. And I think Michael said it nicely. And what's interesting is that most of us have begun in different places. And most of us are sort of settling in different places now, you know, Orthodoxy, Reformed, Judaism, all these different areas. But what we have in common is actually this pathway that the story sort of nicely represented. But okay, so now we have a sense of oneness, and we're experiencing a degree of oneness in this little corner. But that doesn't mean all of the synthesis that we have to do is, is sort of resolved for us. So now we have to figure out, what we're going to do with Hermes, and we have to figure out what we're going to do with Jesus and Muhammad, and I mean, all of these things. And so it is sort of cyclical, and it is sort of spiral, in that, well, okay, we've all sort of passed through the nihilism phase and said, no, you don't really want to live there. And we passed through the political phase and said, well, you need to have a politic, but that can't be at the top of your hierarchy. So, and I think in many ways, that's exactly what we're doing in this little corner. And, you know, I think we're just tremendously blessed to be able to do this together with this technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
Paul, in regards to the supernatural and like the pluralism there, I remember comments that you had made a while back, it's probably a year or so. So, and you probably have done that more than once, but it was something to the effect of, you know, been around long enough, and I don't doubt miracles or the supernatural happening. It's just harder to reconcile for when they don't happen. So I see that the conversations going on with Nate and other folks on, okay, well, here we are contending with the supernatural, and you're going to have a division between those who are in this immanence now and those, you know, dealing with the supernatural. And what struck me about that is is a conversation. I think it was with Neil deGrasse, maybe Roland. So sometimes, you know, as I've encountered the Orthodox Church in different circles, there's tall tales of sorts, and I think that both from the tall tale side and from the skepticism side, whichever end that you're on, the only path to not ending up in division is in humility on both sides, right? Where you're not really sure what's possible, and you're also humble about your understanding about what has or hasn't taken place, and that only in that path of humility can there be a reconciling between those two things.
I want to comment about something that Paul said, but Aaron, you've been here for a while, waiting patiently. So by all means, please share some thoughts.
Okay, well, I have some thoughts, but I have very little to contribute because I was just listening in and I kind of like walked right into the middle of it. And the reason why I'm interested is actually because I had a conversation with Brendan yesterday, and I'm gonna probably upload
with your dad
today. Yeah, with my dad. Yeah. So, and we kind of got into the nitty-gritty of the modern stuff, and I thought that was really productive, and it also helped with sort of showing some of his cards on the table. So he in the end also said, well, you know, if you have N.T. Wright and if you have Bart Ehrman, he said, like, I'm just a Bart Ehrman guy, you know. So like when he looks at the historical stuff, he's like, that's just the stuff that I find, yeah, I don't know, like that interests me. Whereas, you know, if you'd ask my dad, he can credit Bart Ehrman where credit is due, but he also knows that, you know, like, according to my dad, right, he makes a lot of mistakes too. But anyways, my dad also said, like, I have no interest in just kind of bashing on Bart Ehrman on YouTube, so I'm not going to do that. But I think what's interesting nonetheless is that what came up in our conversation was that my dad was trying to convince that the history and researching the history cannot serve as a means to get beyond the history and see it so, and eventually it doesn't matter, but really as a way of like, oh, I care about these people and their lives, sort of these people led and how they lived and how they must have experienced their time. And that helps me sort of see in different ways how it was relevant. So I kind of like wanted to use my dad as a test case, more or less, to point out, right, like, okay, you can also use the historical critical method and not arrive at the conclusion that Brendan saw. So I also asked at the end, would you say my dad is a meta-modern Christian? And he was like, well, I mean, like, I don't want to gatekeep meta-modernity, but he was like, I guess in some ways. So, you know, I'm going to upload that tonight, and you can see that for yourself. I'll post a link. I don't have a huge channel, but maybe, hopefully, somewhere it will show up in the cloud. So I was just kind of listening in to what you guys were saying, and I'm still kind of forming my thoughts around it. So I don't have a lot of formed thoughts myself. I'm really just kind of in flux. So other people are very free to talk. So just keep talking, and I'm listening in happily.
Thank you for sharing. And I think that's awesome that you're also getting your father involved in this, just because like it's ultimately we all represent a small part of our own family, which represents a part of the community, and this is how these things grow. So I think that's fantastic.
Right.
Obviously, I also think that there's a lot of weight Brendan puts to archaeology, and like I think he should maybe chill on that. There's only so much weight you could put on that. Like I don't know if that's a hard science necessarily.
Yeah, but even there, like so for instance, like there's one passage where they run to, like I won't spoil too much, but he says like, yeah, if you look at the archaeology, it's like he says stuff that just doesn't make sense, and then my dad will sort of present an entirely new argument because my dad, like this is just my dad's life, so like this is what he thinks about all the time, and he's like, it's just that if you look at this, there is no doubt that this relates back to fishermen still, that they also related. So he's like, oh, okay, I'd never thought about that. So you kind of see him like kind of like thinking for a moment, and he's like, well, but we don't have to get into that stuff. So that's kind of like, I thought it was fascinating to watch. But like, by the way, to Brandon's credit, like I really appreciate his composure in these conversations. So I don't want to bash him either. I think he's an excellent conversation partner, and I also appreciate how he challenges us in this. But sorry, I interrupted you, the archaeologist.
No, I think it's great that he's in this space. Now I'll pivot for a second back to something Paul was saying, but I've often used this term with regards to Judaism, but it's true with regards to all religions and obviously Christianity over the last 2,000 years. But I always talk about how Judaism has built a 2,000-year exoskeleton in the exile, and now it's sort of, it returns back to its the land, and there's this modern state of Israel, and then there's this question, okay, like, we're Jewish. What does that mean? How much of this exoskeleton from exile do I carry on with me? And even if Brendan can come and show, like, guess what? Like the kneecap and the shoulder blade of your exoskeletons, those have been disproven scientifically. Great. If I disconnect it right now, my spine will fall. So it's too late for me to just start taking pieces off. And you would have to have a surgery, a qualified surgeon or a synod or a Sanhedrin. Only they could look and be like, okay, I'm gonna, weave this web and take this out and make this change. Now, for many, many years, this was a necessity, right? I need to survive from pogroms. I need to stay away from the Gentile. The Catholic needs to be scared of the Protestants, Calvinists. So everyone's playing their game. And so much of the religion is also playing offense because I'm creating this is my narrative and this is my structure. Then we get to this, we're at this world of, post-modernity, right? Where like all the narratives, they don't mean anything. And then there's a question of like, well, is there a hierarchy of narratives? So we're in a place right now where, we're aware now that the media is lying. They're always lying. We're aware now that the politicians are making up nonsense. Great. So we're left with our traditions. And this obviously relates to the meaning crisis. But with our traditions themselves, like Brendan is saying, like, how fortunate you are that your father's like a theologian or like so you have some context like this. But now when these separations are coming apart, not only because I'm looking to lower boundaries, but also they're happening because there's a supercomputer in my phone that has live chats, and Father Stephen DeYoung, like I'm saying, is interacting with. So once that's happening, you can't necessarily tell people like, yes, there's we're all one, but really I also have to pick a lane. Okay, if I'm gonna have to pick a lane and you're showing me that all these options are sort of okay, what do I do? And now this is why I think Paul is such an interesting character, Paul, PBK Paul, is because seemingly, specifically in the Christian context, but we all could learn from it, is an example. Like Paul, you're saying, I read these books, I did these things. Great, you're an example, Paul, of someone who is slowly but surely removing and changing the exoskeleton. You're showing a Senate, you're having the conversation, you're bringing all these people on, and we're seeing how someone could, without, and you'll excuse me, Paul's never going to come out and say, now I'm removing exoskeleton, or, you end your sentence with, but I'm a Calvinist, but he has other people are saying, yeah, but I'm not a Calvinist and I agree with you. So, and this is true about Judaism. It's going to be very difficult for a rabbi to now say, because of these historical differences, we're no longer doing X. It's more the people, the population who are committed. Like Sherry was saying about like taking on some sort of a commitment also allows for some freedom, right? Once I allow myself to do that, and we're speaking as a community that is interested in that kind of relationship, then ground up, if we suddenly start seeing, I'm trying to use an example. There's married women need to cover their hair in Judaism. Now, in Israel, slowly but surely, there's a development of, these small little bandanas or these little head covers. So originally, it had to be a much more strict head covering. But as you get to 2024 and you ask yourself, okay, I'm looking on a Saturday at a park full of these Jewish women, all playing with their kids, all observing the Sabbath. And some of them have smaller head covers, some of them have bigger head covers. The idea is all of them are interested to be in this loop. And then the rabbis could respond to that and be like, okay, we see a healthy development growing over here. Now we could slowly take off this part of this exoskeleton. But that is a process that is very, very delicate. If we try to rush it too soon, that's going to be a problem. On the other hand, and like Paul is saying, if the leadership, if the people in charge are not realizing that these changes are being thrusted upon them and they're still playing a game of 20 years ago, you have to start building the jargon, the toolkit of how do I deal with this kind of change? Putting aside LGBTQ, right? If I'm downloading consciousness, you got to have your tools about the Trinity on you, because we're going to be talking about crazy stuff. So
there's two friends that
was great, Kezi.
Yes, thank you. There's two friends here in my life had over the other night, both being wooed by YouTube orthodoxy. I've talked on these spaces before. There's not an Orthodox church for 2 hours. Okay. And this idea of like, because Sherry rightly points out about guys talking about ideas, they want the right idea. They're trying this 20-year-old game that then now that we have this seemingly unlimited access to information. Okay, well, and there's this existential, I want to be right. I want to do the very modern idea of like doing it the right and precise way. And I had them over. I've been friends with them all 5 to 10 years, each of them. And they've watched a few of my videos on here. And because of a language that Kezi's talking about is, I'm trying to talk them off the cliff a little bit of like, not because I don't want them to become Orthodox. Like, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm like, but what makes sense? Like, and what are you really trying to like, what point at, and where do you put these things in a hierarchy of value? The right confession or the right practice, which again, maybe it is. I'm just, but that doesn't always make sense in every context. But if you're stuck in this, I've got to get the right thing. And then I'm looping that to the top.
Which I would say, Christian, I would say like, okay, so this is where we become intuitive, right? When you want to talk someone away from a ledge, it's not because orthodoxy is dangerous. It's because perhaps the intention of what's happening there is dangerous, right? Yes. And you're pointing at, the intention is to be right, which would make everyone else wrong.
Right. Because, and it's about, and so then it comes to like, well, yeah, but maybe somebody's marriage is falling apart. I'm like, let's shift our focus. Like that being right about your faith is going to have actually going to be worse for you if you can't, work on healing this.
Well, the thing is,
but to get to the point of, there's also though these useful tools and languages and inviting people to what seems to make sense is what's the step towards that. Who knows? Maybe in 20 years, for some reason, one of the branches of Orthodoxy wants to put a church in my town, maybe not. Or sometimes like that might be a good opportunity to really say, okay, I'm going to take this thing and move towards that even closer. But what makes sense right now? Okay, maybe you don't want to stay Baptist. That's fine. But like, is it is it this or nothing? And what about these other areas of our lives that may need
Well,
attention?
let me speak as someone who's doing rogue orthodoxy. Because, one of the factors, and here total disclosure, folks, total transparency on my part. One of the factors that I considered in becoming Orthodox was that I didn't have to go to church. Because it's 5 hours away. And I'm like, yeah, I can do that. Because I've been doing it for 23 years, right? But I also now have a way of worshiping at home. I have a prayer book. I have an icon corner of my candles, of my incense, and I can do that at home, right? That's not why I became an Orthodox Christian, but it factored in. It did actually factor in. And then the other part of it was that I didn't have to squish myself into a box. Like, my world didn't have to become smaller. My world became bigger, actually, when I became an Orthodox Christian. So I'm just speaking from my own perspective, right? So, I mean, there's all kinds of reasons people do things, and I totally understand what you're talking about, Christian, about talking people off the ledge. I had a young woman one time ask me if I would pray the sinner's prayer with her when I was evangelical, and I said no, because I just knew that it wasn't the right. It was all off, It was like she's trying to join a club, and I'm like, this is not about clubs, So anyway, Joseph, you're there again.
Joseph,
let's hear from
hit
you.
us up.
Yeah, no, it's hot enough here that my phone overheated on the dashboard there with the video. I missed everything after my phone overheated, basically. So I have no idea where this conversation has gone. So I don't know if I want to bring it back to where it was. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, Yosef, let me try to. Well, you know what? Before I go to Yosef, Lance, let's just go back to you as the moderator of this conversation. Did you feel that I answered your question? And by your response, I think Yosef will understand the context and be able to participate and, of course, illuminate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you expounded on what the questions I had coming out of Christians stuff, and I know that you and Yosef probably have a different view on that. But yeah, I appreciate you jumping in.
Go ahead.
Well, I really like your metaphor, Kezi, and I'd love to hear if you could maybe redo, because Israel to me is such an amazing question. And I think every time I listen to you talk about this, I think, boy, you frame it right. And I track with you because, of course, I'm not working on a nation state. I'm working on a denomination. And so I think that's where Yosef can really be helpful too.
A denomination? That's a little nation.
Yosef, I mean, Yosef actually posted something recently that he rightfully intuited that it would get under my skin, not in a bad way. Just it was very hard for me to read. But and it relates to the question you're asking, Paul. But it was a conversation with two Jews who are self-proclaimed Zionists, and they, which is a loaded term, I realize, and they were talking about what's going on in Israel right now. And one of them said, and like Yosef, you'll help me if I'm botching this up, but basically he said, are we in the right path or not? This is like the question, right? And if King David, who was God's beloved, right, didn't build the temple because his hands were filled with blood, as we're told. That's why his son Solomon has to build it. Forget if you let's assume right now that Israel's fighting a righteous war. Okay, again, putting politics aside. Nevertheless, is this the place Israel wants to be, where this isn't its place right now, where there's so much death connected to it, and that's a challenge for me to like where my people are. And I wrote to Yosef, and this relates also to the meta-modern conversation. Part of me looks at meta-modern and say, you know, bringing sacrifices to the temple. Come on, guys. That's like Maimonides says, that comes from like a pagan place, and we no longer need that. We transcended that, and the ramifications of that would be Lance, potentially no more sacrifices at the temple, right? Then that would be like, you know, there's ramifications to that. On the flip side, I tell myself, Kazi, how do you know, you think you're whole, high and mighty. You think you've reached a spiritual place that all of us right now in this little corner thinking, talkie, the 4 Ps, we're all there. Maybe we're not even at the level of the pagan who appreciated what it was to bring the sacrifice. And I think I'm enlightened, but really I'm so far removed from that truth. So this is a question because I take it seriously when Jacob challenges Zionism, which is fine. It's secular Zionism specifically, which is, I have to ask myself, in this modern world, right? If I am the living, descendant and embodiment of the people of Israel, what does that look like? How does that look like? How does that manifest? And the question really is like, our day off is the Sabbath in Israel. The official language is Hebrew. That means something, but how do I look at my legal system? How do I look at my politicians? How do I look at how I present, how I go out to war? There's something crazy to think about that you have
you're describing what it means to be like you're describing what it means to be in a national religion. Right, church and state kind of thing, the thing that most Americans shudder about, right? And it's just like an intense version.
Yet Dawkins can't wait to go back if he could.
I believe, though, and this is where I also disagree with Jacob, and I think with Yosef a little, but I believe that already to the blessing of Abraham, that the nations of the world would be blessed through you. It's identifying nations. It's identifying that there's going to be different nations. They don't all become one nation, and I use that and that's the universal message of Judaism. But ultimately, when the Israelites come back to the land and there's this conversation, once they realize, we already see this in the golden calf, that they need more. They can't connect directly with the divine. It's too difficult for them. So if you look around you and you see that the other nations around you have a king, that doesn't mean, and we believe the Bible is eternal, that doesn't mean you need a monarchy. It just means you Israelites, okay, when you're trying to create some sort of formation and trying to create a body, look around you at the world, at the nations around you, who are very wise and very smart and godly in their own way. See what system is best working for them, and then you can use that system as well. If it's democracy, great. If it's some sort of king rulership, that also might work. But it's not telling you we have to have a king. So the body politic at some point needs to be integrated inside. That doesn't mean that there can't be still separations, and Jewish law talks about these stuff, but there isn't this complete divide. And that's something that we needed to really take into consideration. Like if in the church might come and say, you have to be punished for your sins, but they themselves are not going to do the lashing, right? They're going to let the state in a certain way take care of you. In Judaism, the Sanhedrin is the one that sentences you. That's because it's been integrated. Having said that, only a violent Sanhedrin was categorized as one that killed someone once every 70 years. Right. So while you have that power, you don't abuse that power. You make sure you have a system that allows people room to grow. But I do believe that ultimately politics itself, while it could still be in a more secular world, still has to be, its foundation still needs to be religious. And that's why for a Jew, looking at an American dollar where it says, "In God we trust," to me is just like, I mean, these are all, indications of like how far we've come as a nation. Like that to me is amazing. I'm sorry. On that note, I got a boogie. Pick up the kids from jiu-jitsu. Take care, people.
Bye, Cassie. Have a good day.
So, Sherry, you were talking about the kind of orthodoxy that you practice. And coming into the Orthodox
rogue.
Church, yeah, rogue Orthodoxy. Thank you. And having been baptized into the church now, or chrismated into the church, I got here very much through a Peterson Peugeot path, and I'm well aware that you have an Orthodox principality barely 100 years ago that became murderous communists, basically overnight.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so, you take any principality, right, and it scales at every level. It's like you, family, community, city, whatever, right? So it scales at all these different levels.
I think human beings just become murderous communists by nature.
Well, so the flesh will. Right?
Joseph, he doesn't like that one.
So then, and the only way one might, I would say, as far as I can tell, the only way that I don't become that, because I effectively did become that, the only way that I don't continue to be that is to be transformed
by the other. By
the other. Well, it's the tension of love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself, and that's being kind of like.
I don't even think that's a tension. So I unfortunately I have to go. So I got to close out with one last reading from the castle, and I think Joseph will really love this because it's a very Jewish way of seeing the world, for one thing. And if Kesi's still listening. So
says the goy.
Says the what? Okay,
as the non-Jew.
Yeah. I don't know. Like I've told Kesi and Jacob and Joseph that I'd love to be Jewish, but I just love Jesus too much. But here it goes. As to the eldest sister, so this is after the storm and the repentance and everything, and then the family starts seeing each other and saying, you are my brother, you are my sister, right? But the eldest sister took her a long time to recover from that whole thing. And she had gone up to her room and so this is Eve, mother of humanity, okay? As to the eldest sister, it was many days before she recovered from the shock. At length one day, her brother came to her, took her by the hand, led her to an open window, and told her to seat herself by it and look out. Now, this is the older brother who gets bound up, put in the basement. He comes up and everything changes. Yes, that's a type of Christ, but it's also Adam, which is also humanity, okay? Which is, you could just maybe try to think of this older brother as the other, okay? She did so, but at first saw nothing more than an unsympathizing blaze of sunlight. So she only saw what she was looking at. But as she looked, the horizon widened out, and the dome of the sky ascended, till the grandeur seized upon her soul, and she fell on her knees and wept. Now the heavens seemed to bend lovingly over her and to stretch out wide cloud arms to embrace her. The earth lay like the bosom of an infinite love beneath her, and the wind kissed her cheek with an odor of roses. She sprang to her feet and turned in an agony of hope, expecting to behold the face of the Father, because they're waiting, right, for the Father to show up. But there stood only her brother, looking calmly through, though lovingly, on her emotion. I might cry. She turned again to the window. On the hilltops rested the sky. Heaven and earth were one. And the prophecy awoke in her soul that from between them would the steps of the Father approach. Hitherto she had seen but beauty, but now she beheld truth. Often had she looked on such clouds as these and loved the strange ethereal curves into which the winds molded them, and had smiled as her little sister told her what curious animals she saw in them and tried to point them out to her. Now they were as troops of angels, jubilant over her new birth, for they sang in her soul of beauty and truth and love. So this is where the Father comes. He comes when we realize that when we look at our brother, and that's how George MacDonald describes Christ, as our older brother. When we look at our brother, suddenly we know that from between there, that place where heaven and earth meet, that's where the Father comes from. And I just, I know that this is what Judaism is about because this is what Israel does. This is what Judaism does. It has never rejected otherness in favor of its own, right? But it acts like a mediator for that otherness to be in the world so that we can look at each other and say, you are my brother and you are my sister. So with that, I'm going to say hasta luego and cry a little harder. Bye.
I'll have to talk to you about that later, Sherry. That was interesting. I keep losing the connection. Now I'm parked at least. So maybe I realized before when I did get cut off the first time, I ended in a really inopportune place, evidently, when my phone overheated. It ended on democracy is terrible. I don't want to, that's not what I want the message to be. It was, I think the quote is democracy is terrible, but every other form of government is worse. There's also a very similar thing in philosophy and ethics philosophy around utilitarianism that like everyone can kind of agree on utilitarianism, but like very few people actually want to be utilitarians. It's like the secular space, like the space where we don't kill each other and it's workable, but it's not the best. Therefore, this is way off topic from what Sherry was talking about, but it's not totally unrelated. That the thing that the biggest containers aren't necessarily the best containers for like seeing the world through. And I think I'm going to connect it back to what Sherry said now, because Judaism did understand the nations of the world as children of God, and Israel being the firstborn, it was not the firstborn and therefore rejecting all the brothers, because that is a pattern in Genesis, but that's not the pattern that Genesis ends on, right? The pattern we're trying to overcome in Genesis over and over again. And in fact, it does, right? So we have the overcoming of that. What Sherry just read sounded a lot to me like, some very keen-eyed observers of reading the Binding of Isaac noticed that throughout the whole story, it says that Abraham and Isaac walk together. They walk up the mountain together. They go on the journey together. They come down from the mountain together. But then only Abraham goes back to Beersheba, not Isaac. Where does Isaac go? We find out later when Rebecca's coming that Isaac has been hanging out with his brother Ishmael at the Be'er L'chai Roi. I don't know how Christians translate that. The well of the living God, or the God who sees. Sorry, the well of the God who sees. That's where Hagar and Ishmael live, and that's where Isaac goes after this, let's say, pretty traumatic event. We can say that because we don't have to psychologize it so much, because Jacob calls the God of his father the fear of Isaac, right? That's how he understands how his God relates, how his father relates to God. But he finds healing from that in some way by going and hanging out with Ishmael, who also was sent to the desert and almost killed by their father. And they reconcile out there, because next time we hear about them together, it's for burying their father, right? So they do have this kind of peaceful motif, but we also have that reconciliation with Esav. It's not quite as strong, but even more importantly, right? Genesis ends with the flipping of the blessings between Ephraim and Manasseh, and they don't fight about it. They don't get angry. Like Joseph thinks that they're going to get upset and is afraid that this pattern is going to repeat, but they've overcome that pattern, right? In Genesis, the whole point is not that we keep it stuck. We're stuck in this pattern and it never gets healed. The whole point of Genesis and into the beginning of Exodus is that the pattern of the brothers from Cain and Abel does get healed, and the role of what a brother's supposed to be, we hear about that become idealized, because we have Ephraim and Manasseh, and we also have Moses and Aaron, right? That's the epitome of this, where they love each other, and Aaron isn't upset that Moses is going to be the leader of one thing, and Moses isn't upset that his brother is going to be the high priest and he's not, right? They support each other and are there to like encourage each other's strengths and be there for each other's weaknesses in this like super compatible way that Genesis has been working toward since Cain and Abel, right? We had failure and failure and failure, but there are different levels of failure and spectrums of failure that eventually get healed, right? And then we hear, at least in like the Jewish understandings of the tribes, like Issachar and Zvulun, is that one of them kind of runs the government, one of them runs the economy of the Northern Kingdom, and they're all, or government or the religious Sanhedrin, whatever. There's different versions, but like they're basically there and they're fully compatible with each other. They're one body, but they have different roles in that body, and they're supposed to be doing different purposes. And their relationship with each other and with God are unique, right? So the contention here, this is what I was trying to point to earlier with the metamodernism, is that I think there's a fundamental assumption that something that's more universal is better. Somehow that, but to me, that's very anti-personalist. And I'm coming from a world, I do machine learning, statistics, right? Like if you're just going to treat everything like a statistic, maybe on average, for the average human, if we take everyone across the planet, across all cultures, and just ignore everything else, okay, maybe there's some like thing that is a slightly better way than others. But if we actually treat people as persons that are embedded in the West, in a culture, baptism in the middle of, I don't know, the Midwest. I can't remember where you live, Christian, but 2 hours from an Orthodox church, wherever it is, right? Arkansas. Okay. Like if you actually deal with people where they're from, both like in a cultural sense, but also a geographical sense, a communal sense, like, and have a concept that, like, if we're really children of God, God would treat, like, we treat our children differently, and that's not a bad thing. You don't necessarily want that difference to cause jealousy and hatred and fighting, right? That's the problem of Genesis. But ideally, what you would do if you're a good, ideal, perfect, whatever father, let's say the father of the world, is you would have a unique relationship with each of those children. And that is at different resolutions. That's at the national level, so like, as well as the individual level. And you would therefore show your love and care and want, each of those individuals to have that different relationship and use their strengths and weaknesses, like their personal ones, in the best way. So this is where I think there's metamodernism to me falls apart. This like whole argument for like we want the most universal container for everything. And I think this is where for Vake's Silk Road works a lot better. If you think about the bare minimum as a place to exchange ideas and not kill each other, and kind of we can cooperate, but at the same time, like we don't like it's the personalist concept that takes priority over the universalist. I think that, to me, makes a lot more sense. But I mean, I'm coming from I'm coming from a Jewish frame, which, as many will point out, is very particularistic, and even some understand that as tribal. But I'm trying to point out it's not tribal exactly, because it's more this like, it's what Shari was talking about. It's this sibling frame where you're not supposed to be in zero-sum competition, and we're trying to overcome that. And this is, I mean, get into these conversations around Noahidism or anything like that, like you'll see how that gets embodied. But like, I think this is a very different type of universalism than Christian universalism. So there's a different universalism where everyone's going to be the same religion and be the same thing, and that there are versions of that can go down I can go down a path of Babel, right? Where everyone, like, or pre-Babel, where they're building the tower, everyone to be the same thing and having the same words and like having the same ideas and working together. But there's a problem with that, right? It's like this forced conformity problem, or whatever you want to call it, authoritarianism problem. There's lots of different interpretations depending on if you go political or social or psychological with what happened to Babel. But like, it's very, very different from a universalism where everyone is still treasured for what they are uniquely and personally.
Yeah. I was with Brendan when my conversation that I had with him was saying something like, this seems more the personalized nature of what I see happening in these spaces that we hang out in, which I don't think I've ever met you, Joseph, so nice to meet you, but is that, and you too, Michael, is that this seems more meta than something like a universalism, like you're saying. Like I'm agreeing with that I think this is much more that than something that it's at the same time transcending and at the same time not transcending, like you were talking about the contextual nature of your life. And that's what's so unique about like coming into a space and then coming out of a space, like actually doing that, like coming into a digital space and then coming back out into the physical space, that the realities of that are profound. And I wanted to point back to something that Kezi was talking about when, you know, as he was kind of touching on the nation state. Paul's conversation with, and then also Joseph, what you were talking about, about this the contextual nature of things. That some, you know, America had, the United States has, yes, in our Constitution, separation of church and state. And this is one of those weird things about some of the other conversations about the literal or the literary, is that, yes, that's our Constitution. But in reality, we were a Protestant nation state that had a unity of multiplicities of presidents that were different religious, you know, affiliations, but at the same time, say Christian or something like. But whereas in England, you had to be Anglican, you know, there just wasn't any question about that. And so there is and that the brother thing, the sibling thing, and then you went into this parallel with the structure of, you know, Mosaic, desert, tabernacle Judaism with his brother. I mean, it kind of reminded me of this, how it's supposed, you know, on paper, supposed to operate with checks and balances in the three branches of government in the United States, where like these things, there's a diversity and the unity and all these types of stuff. And I don't want to like go down on that track, but I guess we're trying to point at things, and we're at a unique time in history where people can get on and have real conversations about these things, and bang around a little bit, and maybe hopefully make some sense. But man, it was nice to meet you guys, and I'm gonna head off here. Lance, thanks for opening up the floodgates today.
So when I was coming out of this hyper rationalist communist mindset, that also meant repairing my relationship with my parents. Super evangelical Pentecostal, deep Trump folks. A few years before that, I would have said some really nasty things about those people. And in having had to eat a lot of humble pie on this path back, one of the places of common ground that I've found with my mom, obviously being in a very different tradition that I participate in regularly right now, is I am most, I mean, like we came to agreement that we are most ourselves in Christ, right? That's language that we could agree on, right? Like you are most you in Christ, you're most liberated, right? You have the most identity and individuality, and you are the most you in Christ. Because outside of that, other things start taking you, right? And to me, that it's how do you stop fighting? How do you stop killing each other? How do you see people as your siblings, as your brother, as united in any way, even though you have your particularity, right, and your own individuality, that you're not them, you are part of a different group, but still find unity. And it, to me, that strikes a chord when I was going through Daniel Boran's work, and when he's talking about the translation of Son of Man, it's very strange. And one of the ways he tries to convey that is it's something like humanity, but even that's a reduction. It's a complex idea. And so in some sense, the Son of Man, the Anointed One, Christ, is something like the nature of what it is to be human that unites you or binds you together at all, right? It's the only capacity for that. Everything else is divisions leading you towards death, right? And I think that that's ultimately why you've got something like Saint Basil, who tells all the early Christians, you better read Homer before you even really read some of these manuscripts within the Bible, because you have to understand the way that these principalities play on men, bring divisions, bring death. You have to be able to see that reality in front of your eyes before you can even appreciate what might bind you together enough to stop killing each other and hating each other.
Howard.
Hey, Michael. Nice to meet you.
Likewise.
Yeah, I love what you just said. I just jumped in because I'm a big believer in just being in every open chat and being face to face with everybody. So, but I mean, I jumped in at a good time. That sort of unifying identity that you're talking about, and that it coming through historical events and things that were written down, and a whole unfolding of things for us to understand. I mean, I guess one of the areas I'm into is writing and storytelling, and also comedy. I'm mostly a comedian, but is like during the movie, you're always like, why did they need to go through that whole thing? Why couldn't they just have the wisdom that they have at the end, at the beginning? Why did they need to get divorced and then they go through all this? It's like, no, that's like part of the thing, that going through the challenges and the hardships and gaining the wisdom, having like someone like William Shakespeare or Homer, or these things that just stand the test of time, like that is only possible going through the challenges and the hardships. It's not just, oh, well, William Shakespeare's, he's just sort of saying like, just do this, go do that. No, his plays are all about characters going through difficult times. And I guess the counterpoint, the thing that might clarify this, the thing when that doesn't happen, a good example is like traditional Christian or modern Christian art, of like Christian movies, God's Not Dead, which take very unflawed people who love God and are good, and then something kind of bad happens, but then it doesn't really shake their faith in any deep way. And then people are like, why do these movies suck? And it's like, well, your story sucks. So, you didn't go through the hardship. You didn't test your characters as harshly as possible. When you look at like Ivan in Brothers Karamazov, like he's like ripping Alyosha to shreds. Like Ivan's like the atheist who's way smarter than Alyosha and just rips him to shreds the whole book. But somehow going through that, Alyosha's faith comes out on the other side stronger. So I don't know if that's exactly the point you were making, Michael, but that's what it made me think of.
Well, tying this to the meta modern conversation going on here, it's like, okay, well, we've talked a lot about enchantment in these circles for the last few years. And it's like, well, it doesn't necessarily when enchantment happens, things are going to get a little crazier, right? Because now you're in a much more complicated world where invisible animating spirits are very clearly working their way through peoples all the time. Right. So now you're in like an enchanted pagan reality, and you can see something like Tom Holland pointing at like the resurrection of the Greek gods, where it's like, oh, you can really see this at play right now. So here you are at the death of rationalism and deconstruction, and then here's this enchanted reality, but then that's a nightmare too. Right. But one of the beautiful things that comes out of that, right, out of that conflict, right, is like so many empires and kings and peoples before us, they start going, well, which God is highest? Which one's the most powerful? Right. Which is the one that so is it Mars? Is it Apollo? What is it that you were? Because if you unite people around Apollo and you have beauty and vitality and blah, 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 right? Maybe you'll be the strongest nation. Maybe you can have Rome be eternal, right? And so it's something like the conquering, right? So very much the Christian assertion on that is like, yeah, well, the Lord of hosts is then revealed as the highest, right, which everything is under, and should you align yourself to that, then the best chances that you have towards an enchanted meta-modern reality integrated with both the visible and invisible in a way where you're not at war and killing each other is in submission to this invisible that is the highest, right? This is what Enoch and the transformation of man, right, seems to point at, and it's the same spirit which Paul is attempting to communicate in the epistles, the same tradition within Revelation. It's an assertion. It's an assertion about, I don't know. It's like being most in line with natural law, right, and reality as such.
Yeah, I think that submission's important. Sherry brought that up a while back when she was reading the story, the subordination and everything else. I think when I'm thinking about the traditional SIFs and the kind of the meta-modern Christianity, like one of the things people really push back on is submitting, right? You can call that obedience, right? It can be, I want this new thing, this relevant thing. Please talk to me. I want to live the way I want to live. I want to talk to me in the way I want to talk, whatever. And it's just like, actually, we all know that obedience is the way to freedom, right? So if you're a musician, you've got to practice those scales, right? You've got to practice those scales. You've got to do the hard work. If you're a comedian, you've got to get up and do it. And you've got to hone your chops, and you got to get in front of people, and you got to try stuff out. And the best comedians are extremely disciplined and do the work. You don't just go up there and just crush an hour-long set, right? So we all know in our life that the difficult things that we need to do are kind of the submission. And so one of the things that I would say, and I would just say this to me personally, like living out in the charismatic world, or hey, we can do whatever we want. We don't have to fast. We can just do this, and Christ doesn't make us do anything. I want to be free. I want to be able to free to express how we want. We want to do things we want. It's kind of like that's not how things work. And certainly Jordan Peterson bust on the scene. Why is clean your room? Why is do these things, right? That's obedience. It's submission. It's gathering discipline. Why do people, when they come into 12-step groups, they say, hey, here's the suggested program. Well, I don't want to do that. It's fine. You don't have to. Good luck with that, right? And so I think when I think meta-modern, and when I hear people talk about like Brandon Graham Dempsey and others trying to create this new thing, and then we're trying to look how things are now, we want to do that to some extent, I almost feel like that's an unwillingness to subordinate yourself to the pattern realities and the disciplines that were given to us that connect us to, as you're talking about. Like I think the practices and the patterns that and the disciplines we do in our own life should connect us to bring heaven to earth, connect us to God. And for me, it would be Christ, like the Jesus prayer, those sorts of things. And then that discipline manifests itself in more freedom and more connection. Also, when I do those things, what it does is it connects me to unity and multiplicity. It connects me with my fellow man too, right? Like, I think to ultimately get to the connectedness, and I would just say this, I think for me, spiritual practices, whether I see that in a 12-step group or whether I see that in orthodoxy or whatever, disciplined, ascetical, spiritual practices, what it will manifest is seeing that you are connected and everyone, all of humanity is your brother and your sister, right? Those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
I think.
And just saying it like, hey, can't we all just get along? And, some sort of bland universalism that Joseph was talking about previously.
Well, okay, so John, but partially we have to contend with the nature of Christ through a Johannian perspective, right? It's like fully truth, like all truth, all grace, right? Both Logos, Christ is all truth, all grace. It is the discerning love of a father to be like, here's the right thing, but I'm not going to force you to do it, right? So the love of the father doesn't possess or coerce, right? but then there's and part of the reason is the full grace that's there too, right? So then it's the reason why Paul in the epistles is like, okay, well, circumcision isn't necessary, and he also has someone circumcised within his own community and performs it himself because it would be a sin within that community. Okay, so let's say within my family, it's we go, okay, to you and like to the three of us in this conversation on here right now, if I put this cup right over here, right, you guys don't care, and I'm not sinning against you. I'm not missing the mark within the confines of our relationship. But let's say with my family, cups always belong on the table on the coaster, right? And so with them, if I put the cup in the wrong place, I've missed the mark. And now, in a sense, I'm sinning against them, even though within the community here, I'm not sinning, I'm not missing the mark, right? And so there's a particularity to it. And it's like, well, how the heck do you navigate that? Because rationalistically, you can't, it doesn't make sense, right? And so there's a paradox. Rationally, oh, it's okay, it's not okay with it. So to walk in Logos, to walk in Christ with all the grace and all the truth, is in relation of love to each other. So if I love my family and I care about their rules, right? And I care about not missing the mark against my mom and leaving a ring on her table, I'll put the cup on the coaster, right? And this is what allows us to be good citizens, be good Roman citizens. But then there's also a threshold, because if that family or the Roman Empire or the US or whatever it is takes you to a place that has you indulge in the flesh that bears bad fruits, right? Fruits of death. That's where the line is drawn. And we speak the truth about that to the point where you have Christian martyrs.
Yeah. I mean, to your example, I know this by heart, but if it looks like I'm reading, it's you guys, it's just my eyes. 2 Corinthians 3:3 of, and you show that you are a letter from Christ delivered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. And I think that gets to the meta aspect, because you will be in places where there are no established rules.
No.
You will be in zones where you can't write down all the rules because things are changing too much. What you're perceiving is changing, your context is changing, the people around you, all these things. So ultimately, just writing everything down and just submitting to everything that's been written down isn't as effective as saying Christ within you is going to navigate those decisions for you, and your job is to submit to Christ in that way. And the Holy Spirit will write that on your heart. In the same way, like Moses will be given the words to say when he speaks to Pharaoh. He's not going to do it. He's not, oh, well, here's the list. Here's everything you need to say. Make sure you hit line item 1, 2, 3. There's this meta spirit that tells you what to do in the right context, in the right time. So yeah, and then that sort of gets, you could say, oh, that makes submission hazy, because it's like, what are you submitting to? You can't write it down. You can't say these are the propositions I accept or don't accept. But that's the only way I can see forward that you can have something worthy of your submission, is it being the meta thing that can handle all these other situations.
Okay. So on that note, so here I am in the Orthodox Church, and there's an aspect of which I need to submit, but there's also times where I need to lead, right? And both things exist. And there's people within the church that certainly need to lead, and then I'm submitting to them. Then what are they doing? Well, they're having to submit to someone else. Now, in order to do either of those things, or in order to lead well or submit well, I don't think that it's really a question of those things. And maybe this is a little bit of Protestant roots coming out of me or something, but it's like the Son of Man is the only Elohim that won't possess and coerce you. It is one that cooperates with you if you're willing if you will have the humility to ask, to pray, right? If you will turn your eyes up, like Peter on the water, if you will set your eyes on Christ, then you'll be on the water. But the minute you take your eyes off and you're no longer cooperating with him, you will sink. You will be immersed. The chaos below will come and swallow you up, just like that.
Well, to that point, is it that the important thing that happens is happening in tandem within the person with Christ? It's not like we can set up the world and we just need to get people to operate correctly in that setup world. It's that the people in the world are the place where the important thing is happening, and their decision to cooperate with Christ, to put Christ first. That's the magic. That's the important thing. Is you could set up like, oh, utopia, whatever, but it would turn into, I mean, it's funny. I just watched the Truman Show at my church. I don't know if you know that movie, but it's all about trying to set up paradise without consent. It's trying to trick this person into living in paradise. But it's actually Truman's internal posture, his internal desire for truth, his internal desire to know the world, know reality. That's the important part. It's not that the city he's in is this perfect place, but it's that he's said the most important thing is that I find the truth, and love and a lot of these qualities are wrapped up, and it doesn't matter what I have to give up, but I'm going to orient towards that above all else.
Yeah, and I think the key is like, because this isn't something that's orthodox. This is something that was very obvious to me when I was pastoring. All over the place, it's obedience, right? Like if you like, you'll love me, you obey my commandments, all those other sorts of things, and it's a personal obedience into a way of living, right? It's not to propositions or anything else like that. Like it's in the way you live. And then, the personal, like the things that you do, like being reconciled, like it's committing into these practices in this way of life, which then transforms you, which then ultimately becomes a light, and the way you interact with your people around you, like you bring the love, the change, the pray for your enemies, like all that stuff, like you become this transformed person through doing that. And then you do that both individually, and like you talked about it, Michael, earlier, like you do that individually, then you do it within your family, right? And then you do it at your local parish or church, right? And that stuff just kind of, it just kind of scales up. But clearly there's an obedience into certain patterns and ways of doing things that has been revealed by God. And if you do those things, it doesn't mean your life is going to go well, i.e. the storms of life aren't going to hit you. Tragedy is going to hit, all those other things. But you'll have an ability to withstand the storms of life. You'll have an ability in difficult situations with your neighbors to have the right sort of be in the right. They talk about your spiritual condition in 12-step programs. Like if your spiritual condition is good, by the way, you can lose it in 5 minutes. But if your spiritual condition is good, what you find is your actions with your fellows are just better. They're just better. And then all of a sudden there's this attractiveness that people see in you, light, that they're like, why are you different? What's going on here? Right? Particularly that stuff really shows up to people when they see it, is when you get hit with some calamity of life that they see undo other people. And that somehow we've all seen that person who that tragedy strikes and they're able to have some grace as they go through that. Not that they do it perfectly or all the time, but there's something there that people are like, what does that person have? And so on and so forth. So I do think as we talk about this, and I'm gonna have to wrap this up a little bit, and I'm gonna have to ruminate on this, is I do think what I perceive out of just like Metamodern has lots of different contexts. Some people are going to create some new thing, which is something that goes beyond Christianity and Judaism, whatever that is, right? And then some people are thinking about it within the context of, their faith or whatever, so on and so forth. But we talk about this traditional shift. I think, and I'm going to be looking for this now, is some of this shift away from modernity? Is it away from, is some of that a way of not being willing to be obedient to the revelations that are true and will always be true?
So Lance, the only thing that really stood out to me, so it's okay. Hear and do, right? Who is my mother? Who is my brothers? Those who hear and do, right?
Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say?
Yeah. And, okay, another both and, right? And Abraham negotiates. And we're grappling with. Right. And so there is an obedience, right? And to be in the straight and narrow, but it's not a propositional thing. There is a grappling, it's a narrow gate.
Well, with Job, so what you're talking about is, and we talk about, and Sherry and Jess talk about this a lot, is he maintained his integrity in the midst of, I want a mediator, questioning what, I want you to give me an answer. What did I do? Like within his integrity, he didn't accept what his friends were saying and everything else. He had this integrity, and deep down never cursed. And yet he still was willing to be honest and wrestle, right? That was a wrestling with God in some ways, and so on and so forth. So I think that's right. Like, you don't have to become some sort of automaton.
Yes.
But
you don't lose your identity. In fact, it's transfigured to the highest version of itself.
Yep.
The one thing, Lance, I wanted to jump in on is I'm not fully convinced that, like, that posture, that commitment, like, that you're going to see the payoff in terms of, like, oh, and then this situation happened and you saw this glow in the person. And even as this thing happened, even as the divorce happened, he was able to just have this posture. She was able to have this posture of not, this not becoming angry, not going and not sinning. Because I think, like, if you look for that payoff, if you look even for those, obviously there are fruits of the Spirit, but if you look for those too much, I think you miss how little we're able to encapsulate the stories.
No, and I think that's really good. So that one of the things that you will see about the ascetical practices is you do those without really any end goal in mind, right? Because you can't, like, it's not a game you can rig, right? And so like Evagrius Ponticus talks about in this, I can't remember what the name of the book is. It's a real short little book, but one of the things he talks about is practice leads to gnosis, right? And so you practice the gospel virtues, and then that ultimately leads to, revelation, knowledge from God, right? Now it's within the confines of, spiritual fatherhood or whatever. But also this talks about that when the student is ready, those will appear. And so, and I think some of us, like, so for example, I have, one of the things I've learned is I haven't dealt with some of the intense tragedies in my life well as an individual man. In fact, I found myself down in a pit of shame and not reacting appropriately. One of the things I've learned about myself through all that is that one of the things I need to learn how to do is learn how to suffer well. Because in some of my trials, I have made things worse for my family and my children and myself and others, right? Now, hopefully I said this, that I'm a man that needs to learn a lesson, right? And so I have learned some of those lessons, and that's hard-won stuff. You got to go through it and whatever, and I continue to seek and learn and whatever. I do think that through those trials and those tribulations, that hopefully I will, through the experience of doing it poorly, hopefully when those things come up now, I will do them better. And part of that is, like, again, I have found in my own personal life that when my spiritual condition is good, that my actions, I more easily act, and let's just say more Christ-like, if that makes sense. And just because I failed miserably in those things, it doesn't mean that part of part of what, part of what my story is, that people can see, and I share it, like I will share this in 12-step recovery groups or whatever like that, is that even though I have continued to fail and fall down, I get back up and continue to seek and try to do better now. Right. And so like, if you have failed miserably, it's like, you don't have to give up. Like, just keep getting back just keep getting back in and trying to, continue to seek and do it better.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that. And there's that falling down, and that gives rise to the story and the story we tell about ourselves, our own life of I've stumbled, and I keep, here's journey. I keep going into the underworld, adapting, losing, changing, returning, all these things. The thing I'd say is, when you look at all those stories, like, those are going to happen. You don't have to worry about, like, I hope a story happens in my life. I hope this stuff goes. I hope this stuff happens. I think the freedom is when you just say, like, that stuff's going to happen, the good parts, the bad parts, the everything. So I don't need to, like, oh, well, this is going to, I don't need to try and control that, because the more, because then that's just going to change the way the story unfolds. Really, I can just focus on the primacy of, like, the practice and the faithfulness. And I'm not saying that you ignore the lessons of life, but I think when you try and put yourself too much, oh, God needs me to do this, God needs this to happen. God doesn't need anything. God is perfect. Yep. And so it gives you this posture to be like, I'm just going to be faithful, and all this other stuff is still going to happen, and I'm still going to have to respond to it, and I'm still going to have to go on the journeys. But from, like, before those stories start, before we even put pen to paper, before we even, like, start writing the narrative in our head of, my new boss sucks, oh, I love this woman, oh, that my car crashed, I got in a car crash. Before we even start writing that, the first posture being towards, like, faithfulness and the completeness in Christ, that's like the best position we can take, and also the freest position, because it's not a position of, I need this, or this is the goal, or this is the way the story needs to go. And so that's I don't think it's disagreeing with what you're saying. I just think that that's the, and then once you take that position, then you get all the fruits. Then you get the, like, then you can live the sanctified life. Then you can, you're not trying to grasp onto the story and write it. You're just being faithful to what you believe is the highest value.
Yeah, and the discipline and the practices, how that plays out is, if it's truly a practice and a habit you've built out, there's a couple things that I've latched onto now, and I've shared. I've got a conversation with Christians coming out, and I kind of speak to it. But I've had some situations happen that I've kind of knocked the wind out of my sails, and I've immediately been able to fall back on certain practices I'm doing now because they're habit. And in the moment, and throw everyone else out, like just throw out what this means to anyone else and whether they're seeing me do this or not.
Yeah.
I was able to immediately go into this habit, and in my own personal self, take myself out of the whirlwind and grab a little piece. You know what I mean? Because I had a practice that had become a habit that allowed me to get myself centered more quickly in a very tumultuous moment. And so I do think that you just do them because others have said, hey, I've done this, and this like, whatever, like, there is some important people telling you those things. And so I do think there's some sense of, but I do really want to hook into, which is, I think it's okay to have some hope that these practices will provide these fruits will manifest these fruits in me. I think that's okay. I think you're exactly right to say, though, is you can't pursue them. Like, those are gifts that are given, and you just need to receive them. And a lot of times they happen, like, they just happen, and you don't know that they're going to happen until the thing happens, and you exhibit that, let's just say, fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah. Before I forget, at some point we should talk about Owen Cyclops. Maybe not today. We're probably running out of time, but because I'm also into him. But that's completely off what you're talking about. I totally agree. To me, especially as like a writer, and these stories are just inevitable. Like the the hero falling into the unexpected world, adapting, changing, losing something, gaining something, returning, like that's just going to happen. Like it just, you don't even have to like hope for it, because it's like, that's just the way the world works. You know, it's just as simple. And really taking the back posture of like waiting. And one way that helped me see this is I grew up in a very sort of competitive world where it was all about you know, what college are you going to get into? What degree are you going to get? What kind of job are you going to get? And one thing I thought is being smart and being hardworking are not good or bad inherently. But when the point is to be smart or to be hardworking, then you've lost the container. You've lost the higher value that situates it. And when you realize every society that's ever existed has had hardworking people and lazy people, it's had smart people and it's had stupid people. And, you know, the fact that I happen to be a handsome, smart, hardworking person. No, I'm just kidding. But, you know, like to force it and to see like, no. My gifting is to be smart and hardworking. And that's what matters. And I've always been told that smart and hardworking, you know, which of course becomes just the hilarious part is people put smart and hardworking there because it's just a way of saying I want a lot of money and worldly success without saying that I want a lot of money and worldly success. Because no one cares about the, you know, really smart engineer at UPS who makes $100,000 a year. You know, they care about the guy who makes $5 million as a lawyer. But the point there is just, it's inevitable. Like you will always have smart people. You'll always have hardworking people, maybe to different degrees, maybe comparatively different. But I just think that like, if you just start with the posture of, before I even tell them what to run after, before the gun goes off and the race starts, we just position ourselves with like that orientation towards Christ to the highest value. That's the best. That's going to be the best thing possible. Like you don't need to say, oh, well, I hope someone wins the race. Well, someone's going to win the race. If you have a race, someone's going to win it and someone's going to lose. And then these cycles are going to continue. You don't have to worry about like, oh no, like, you know, if you throw a New Year's party, you don't have to force New Year's to happen. Eventually New Year's will, you know, midnight will hit and it'll be New Year's, you know, but the positioning of like, I want this to be in the right capacity. I want this to be done in the right light. The rest of it is going to happen. The self-sacrifice, the love, the fruits of the Spirit, the gifts of the Spirit, like those will come, those will happen. But, you know, and I don't think we're disagreeing here. It's really helpful to me to think of it that way because it prevents this like, okay, well, we've said hardworking is the best value. So where are you on your hardworking journey? Where are you on this? How's it going? Where's the harvest? Where's the crops? What's really happening? And it's like, this honestly makes it so that you develop in, I think, a perverse way, in a broken way. And it really makes it very personal because it's like, there really can't be a metric to measure this. There is no, other than your own relationship with God and like the meeting you'll have with Christ at the end of your life. There is no, like, you could spend your whole life never getting anywhere. No, you know, nothing ever works out. And then Christ will say like, you know, my good and faithful servant, you know, like that could happen. We don't know. I'm not saying we should want that. But that could be part of a meta story. You could be part of the generations who died in Egypt, who were just, I was a mud brick maker, you know? I was a mud brick maker when I was born. I was a mud brick maker when I died. Nothing good ever seemed to happen. I tried to do my own uprising against Pharaoh. I got beaten down. All my friends got killed. I got made an example of. I was flogged every day. And then I died. And just, you know, I mean, even that heroic element of the story, like you might not even have that. Maybe you never rose up. Maybe you were just the mud brick maker your whole life. And, you know, so I think not that we shouldn't desire the fruits of the Spirit and shouldn't desire these things, but I think that even getting to that place, I don't know. I think there's a value to thinking that way, but there's also a priority value to like just saying like, your will be done, right? You know, your will, not my will. You know, I want to orient, and that's what
let it be unto me.
Yeah.
And let it be unto me.
And I think your practices are exactly right. Of like, we can't just say like, Christ, come into me now. I declare bankruptcy. You know, just like, you know, I do it. You know, we need the the practices are where the magic happens.
Absolutely. I definitely need to get going. Owen Cyclops.
Yeah.
Jess Perfiance is a big Owen Cyclops guy. Jess is an animator, and I also have a kind of an Owen Cyclops. Have you seen his icons where he put kind of the? He has some ones that he has on his website that are pretty cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, if you want to do an Owen Cyclops conversation, we need to get Jess, and we can do a chat about Owen Cyclops.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's kind of annoying because I'm like, it's hard to even keep up with him. I think I'm technically a Patreon member, but it's just like he just puts stuff out. I mean, I haven't read Babyology yet, but I own his volume 1 and a bunch of the stuff. But yeah, I mean, I re-listen to a lot of his podcasts because he doesn't put them out that regularly. So I think I've listened to everything he's put out, but I haven't read everything, and I don't have I don't have all his icons or anything. But yeah. I mean, I think he had a hilarious conversation with Jay Dyer, because Jay's like, what a weird matchup, because I mean, Jay's like trying to grab onto proposition. I mean, it was good because they're both Christians and they didn't end up butting heads. You can tell Jay Dyer's really trying to pin him down and grab onto him, and it's hilarious to see. It's hilarious to see two different views on it, because he's very mystical and relational and experiential, and Jay's very propositional. So that was cool. But yeah, I'm down. But right. I'm sure you got to leave. But thanks for talking. Appreciate it, Lance.
Thanks for everyone.
Thanks, everyone.